Chapter 9 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 9. We sprang apart, for all the world like a guilty pair surprised. Luckily the room was in its normal dim state of illumination, so that to one suddenly entering, the expression on our faces was not clearly visible. On the other hand, the subdued light gave a romantic to the abominable situation. Lola saved it, however. She rushed to Dale. "Do you know what Mr. Gex was just telling me? His illness, it is worse than anyone thought. It's incurable. He can't live long. He must die soon. It's dreadful. Dreadful. Did you know it?" Dale looked from her to me, and after a slight pause came forward. "Is it true, Simon?" A plague on the woman for catching me in the trap. Before Dale came in, I was on the point of putting an airy construction on my indiscreet speech. I had no desire to discuss my longevity with anyone. I wanted to keep my miserable secret to myself. It was exasperating to have to entrust it even to Dale, and yet, if I repudiated her implied explanation of our apparent embrace, it would have put her hopelessly in the wrong. I had to support her. "It's what the doctors say," I replied, "but whether it's true or not is another matter." Again he looked queerly from me to Lola, and from Lola back to me. His first impression of our attitude had been a shock from which he found it difficult to recover. I smiled, and although perfectly innocent, felt a villain. "Madame Brandt is good enough to be soft-hearted and to take a tragic view of a most commonplace contingency." "But it isn't commonplace, by God, it's horrible!" cried the boy, the arrested love for me suddenly gushing into his heart. "I had no idea of it. In heaven's name, Simon, why didn't you tell me? My dear old Simon!" Tears rushed into his eyes, and he gripped my hand until I winced. I put my other hand on his shoulder and laughed with a contorted visage. "My good Dale, the moribund are fragile." "Oh, Lord, man, how can you make a jest of it?" "Would you have me drive about in a hearse instead of a cab by way of preparation?" "But what have the doctors told you?" asked Lola. "My two dear people," I cried, "for goodness' sake don't fall over me in this way. I'm not going to die tomorrow, unless my cook poisoned me or I'm struck by lightning. I'm going to live for a deuce of a time yet, a couple of weeks at least, and you'll very much oblige me by not whispering a word abroad about what you've heard this afternoon. It would cause me infinite annoyance. And meanwhile, I suggest to you, Dale, as the lawyers say, that you've been impolite enough not to say how do you do to your hostess." He turned to her rather sheepishly and apologized. My news had bowled him over, he declared. He shook hands with her, laughed, and walked Adolphus about on his hind legs. "But where have you dropped from?" she asked. "Berlin. I came straight through. Didn't you get my wire?" "No." "I sent one." "I never got it." He swung his arms about in a fine rage. "If ever I get hold of that son of Satan, I'll murder him. He was covered up to his beastly eyebrows in silver lace and swords and whistles and medals and things. He walked up and down the railway station as if he owned the German Navy and ran trains as a genteel hobby. I gave him 10 marks to send the telegram. The miserable beast had sneaked the lot. I'll get at the railway company through the embassy and have a brute sacked and put in prison. Did you ever hear of such a skunk?" "He must have thought you a very simple and charming young Englishman," said I. "You've done the same thing yourself," he retorted indignantly. "Pardon me," said I, "if I do send a telegram in that loose way, I choose a humble and honest-looking porter and give him the exact fee for the telegram and a winning smile." "Rot," said Dale, and turning to Lola, "he's demoralised the whole railway system of Europe with his tips. I've seen him give a franc to the black, greasy devil that bangs at the carriage wheels with a bit of iron. He would give anybody anything." He had recovered his boyish pride in my ridiculous idiosyncrasies, and was in the process of illustrating again to Lola what a splendid chap I was. Poor lad! If he only knew what a traitorous Machiavelli of a hero he had got! For the moment I suffered from a nasty crick in the conscience. "Wouldn't he, Adolphus, you celestial old blackguard?" he laughed. Then suddenly, "My hat, you too are fond of darkness. It gives me the creeps. Do you mind, Lola, if I turn on the light?" He marched in his young way across to the switches and set the room in the blaze he loved. My crick of the conscience was followed by an impulse of resentment. He took it for granted that his will was law in the house. He swaggered around the room with a proprietary air. He threw in the casual Lola as if he owned her. Dale is the most delightful specimen of the modern youth in my acquaintance, but even Dale, with all his frank charm of manner, has the modern youth's off-hand way with women. I often wonder how women abide it, but they do, more shame to them, and suffer more than they realise by their indulgence. When next I meet Maisie Ellerton, I will read her a wholesome lecture, for her soul's good, on the proper treatment a self-respecting female should apply to the modern young man. Dale filled the room with his clear young laugh, and turned on every light in the place. Lola and I exchanged glances. She had adopted her usual lazy and Pantheran attitude in the armchair, and her glance was not that of a happy woman to whom a longed-for lover had unexpectedly come. Its real significance I could not divine, but it was more wistful than merely that of a fellow conspirator. "By George!" cried Dale, putting up a chair by Lola's side and stretching out his long, well-trousered legs in front of the fire. "It's good to come back to civilization and a Christian language and a fireside, and other things," he added, squeezing Lola's hand. "If only it had not been for this horrible news about you, dear old man." "Oh, do forget it and give me a little peace," I cried. "Why have you come back all of a sudden?" "The Wymington people wired for me. It seems the committee are divided between me and Sir Gerald Macnaghten." "He has strong claims," said I. "He's been mayor of the place and got knighted by mistake. He also gives large dinners and wears a beautiful diamond pin." "I believe he goes to bed in it. Oh, he's an awful ass. It was he who said at a public function, 'The mayor of Wymington must be like Caesar's wife, all things to all men.' Oh, he's a colossal ass. And his conceit, my word!" "You needn't expatiate on it," said I. "I who speak have suffered much at the hands of Sir Gerald Macnaghten." "If he did get into Parliament, he'd expect an armchair to be put before him next to the Speaker. Really, Lola, you never saw such a chap. If there was anyone else up against me, I wouldn't mind. Anyway, I'm running down to Wymington tomorrow to interview the committee, and if they choose me, then it'll be a case of, 'Lord, don't help me and don't help the bar,' and you'll see the derndest best bar fight that ever there was. I'll make things hum in Wymington." He went on eagerly to explain how he would make things hum. For the moment he had forgotten his enchantress, who, understanding nothing of platforms and planks and electioneering machinery, smiled with pensive politeness at the fire. Here was the Dale that I knew and loved, boyish, impetuous, slangy, enthusiastic. His dark eyes flashed, and he threw back his head and laughed, as he enunciated his brilliant ideas for capturing the constituency. "When I was working for you, I made love to half the women in the place. You never knew that, did you, dear old stick? Now I'm going in on my own account. I'll make love to the whole crowd. You won't mind, Lola, will you? There's safety in numbers. And when I've made love to them one by one, I'll get 'em all together and make love to the conglomerate mass. And then I'll rake up all the prettiest women in London and get 'em down there to humbug the men." "Lady Kinnersley will doubtless be there," said I, "and I don't quite see her." He broke in with a laugh. "Oh, the mater! I'll fix up her job all right. She'll just love it, won't she? And then I know a lot of silly asses with motor cars will come down. They can't talk for cob-knots, and think the local option has something to do with vivisection, and have a vague idea that champagne will be cheaper if we get tariff reform. But they make a devil of a noise at meetings, and tote people round the country in their cars, holding banners with 'Vote for Kinnersley' on them. That's a sound idea, isn't it?" I gravely commended the statesman-like sagacity of his plan of campaign, and promised to write as soon as I got home to one or two members of the committee whom I suspected of pro-Macnaghten leanings. "I do hope they'll adopt you," I cried fervently. "So do I," murmured Lola in her low tones. "If they don't," said Dale, "I'll ask Raggles to give me an unpaid billet somewhere. But," he added with a sigh, "that would be an awful rotten game in comparison." "I'm afraid you won't make Raggles hum," said I. He laughed, rose, and straddled across the hearthrug, his back to the fire. "He'd throw me out if I tried, wouldn't he? But if they do adopt me, I swear I'll make you proud of me, Simon. I'll stick my soul into it. It's the least I can do in this horrid cuckoo sort of proceeding, and I feel I should be fighting for you as well as for myself. My dear old chap, you know what I mean, don't you?" I knew and was touched. I wished him Godspeed with all my heart. He was a clean, honest, generous gentleman, and I admired, loved, and respected him as he stood there, full of his youth and hope. I suddenly felt quite old and withered at the root of my being, like some decrepit king who hands his crown to the young prince. I rose to take my leave, for what advantage was there in staying, and felt that I was abandoning to Dale other things beside my crown. Lola's strong, boneless hand closed round mine in a more enveloping grip than ever. She looked at me appealingly. "Shall I see you again before you go?" "Before you go?" cried Dale. "Where are you off to?" "Somewhere south out of the fogs." "When?" "At once," said I. He turned to our hostess. "We can't get him go like that. I wonder if you could fix up a little dinner here, Lola, for the three of us. It would be ripping, so cosy, you know." He glowed with a preposterous inspiration. Lola began politely. "Of course, if Mr. de Gex—" "It would be delightful," said I, "but I'm starting at once, tomorrow or the day after. You'll have the dinner when I come back, and you are a full-blown member of Parliament." I made my escape and fled to my own cheerful library. It is oak-panelled and furnished with old oak, and the mezzo tints on the walls are mellow. Of the latter I have a good collection, among them the Prince Rupert, of which I am proud. I threw myself, a tired man, into an arm-chair by the fire, and rang the bell for a brandy and soda. Oh, the comfort of the rooms, the comfort of Roger's, the comfort of the familiar backs of the books in the shelves. I felt loath to leave it all and go vagabonding about the cold world on my lunatic adventure. For the first time in my life I cursed Marcus Aurelius. I shook my fist at him as he stood on the shelf within easy reach of my hand. It was he who had put into my head this confounded notion of achieving humority. "Am I dealing to myself," I asked, "a happy lot and portion?" "Certainly not," I replied, and when Rogers brought me my brandy and soda, I drank it off desperately. After that I grew better, and drew up a merry little commination service. "A plague on the plain inside. A plague on Lady Kinnersley for weeping me into my rash undertaking. A plague on Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos for aiding and abetting Lady Kinnersley. A plague on Captain Vauvinard for running away from his wife, for giving up the army, for not letting me know whether he is alive or dead, for being, I warrant him, in the most uncomfortable and ungettable spot on the globe. A plague on Dale for becoming infatuated with Lola Brandt. A plague on him for beguiling me to her acquaintance, for bursting into the room at that unfortunate moment, for his generous, unsuspecting love for me, for his youth and hope and charm, for asking me to dine with Lola and himself in ripping cosiness. A plague on myself, just to show that I'm broad-minded. And lastly, a plague, a special plague, a veritable murrain on Lola Brandt, for complicating the splendid singleness of my purpose. I don't know what to think of myself. I have become a common conundrum, which provides the lowest form of intellectual amusement. It is all her fault. Listen, I set out to free a young man of brilliant promise, at his mother's earnest entreaty, from an entanglement with an impossible lady, and to bring him to the feet of the most charming girl in the world who is dying of love for him. Could intentions be simpler, or more honourable, or more praiseworthy? I find myself, after 2 or 3 weeks, the lady's warm personal friend, to a certain extent her champion, bound by a quixotic oath to restore her husband to her arms, and regarding my poor Dale with a feeling which is neither more nor less than green-eyed jealousy. I am praying heaven to grant his adoption by the Wilmington Committee, not because it will be the first step of the ladder of his career, but because the work and excitement of a parliamentary election will prohibit overmuch lounging in my chair in Lola Brandt's drawing-room. Is there any drug, I wonder, which can restore a humorous tone to the system? Of course, Dale came round to my chambers in the evening and talked about Lola and himself, and me, until I sent him home to bed. He kept on repeating at intervals that I was glorious. I grew tired at last of the eulogy, and, adopting his vernacular, declared that I should be jolly glad to get out of this rubbishy world. He protested. There never was such a world. It was gorgeous. What was wrong with it, anyway? As I could not show him the combination service, I picked imaginative flaws in the universe. I complained of its amateurishness of design. But Dale, who loves fact, was not drawn into a theological disputation. "Do you know, I had a deuce of a shock when I came into Lola's this afternoon," he cried irrelevantly with a loud laugh. "I thought it was a damnable and idiotic thing to come into my head, but I couldn't help thinking you cut me out. I wanted to tell you. You must forgive me for being such an ass. And I want to thank you for being so good to her while I was away. She's been telling me. You like her, don't you? I knew you would. No one can help it. Besides being other things, she's such a good sort, isn't she?" I admitted her many excellencies while he walked about the room. "By Jove," he cried, coming to a halt, "I've got a grand idea. My little plan has succeeded so well with you that I've a good mind to try it on my mother." "What on earth do you mean?" I asked. "Why shouldn't I take the bull by the horns and bring my mother and Lola together?" I gasped. "My dear boy," said I, "do you want to kill me outright? I can't stand such shocks to the imagination." "But it would be grand," he exclaimed, delighted. "Why shouldn't Mother take a fancy to Lola? You can imagine her roping her in for the committee." I refused to imagine it for one instant, and I had the greatest difficulty in the world to persuade him to renounce his maniacal project. I am going to permit no further complications. I have been busy for the past day or two setting my house in order. I start tomorrow for Paris. All my little affairs are comfortably settled, and I can set out on my little trip to Avernus via Paris and the habitat of Captain Vauvenard with a quiet conscience. I have allayed the anxiety of my sisters, whispered mysterious encouragement to Maisie Ellerton, held out hopes of her son's emancipation to Lady Kinnersley, played fairy godmother to various poor and deserving persons, and brought myself into an enviable condition of glowing philanthropy. To my great relief, the Wilmington Committee have adopted Dale as their candidate at the by-election. He can scarcely contain himself for joy. He's like a child who has been told that he should be taken to the seaside. I believe he lies awake all night thinking how he will make things hum. The other side has chosen Wilberforce, who unsuccessfully contested the Ferny division of Wiltshire at the last general election. He is old and ugly. Dale is young and beautiful. I think Dale will get in. I've said good-bye to Lola. The astonishing woman burst into tears and kissed my hand and said something about my being the arbiter of her destiny, a Gallic phrase which she must have picked up from Captain Vauvenard. Then she buried her face in the bristling neck of Adolphus, the chow dog, and declared him to be her last remaining consolation. Even Anastasius Papadopoulos has ceased to visit her. I uttered words of comfort. "I have left you Dale, at any rate." She smiled enigmatically through her tears. "I'm not ungrateful. I don't despise the crumbs." Which remark, now that I come to think of it, was not flattering to my young friend. But what is the use of thinking of it? My fire is burning low. It is time I ended this portion of my rule and example of humority, which, I fear, has not followed the philosophic line I originally intended. The die is cast. My things are packed. Rogers, who likes his British beef and comforts, is resigned to the prospect of continental travel, and has gone to bed hours ago. There is no more soda water in the siphon. I must go to bed. Paris, tomorrow. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 10. "Ay," says Touchstone, "now am I in Arden, the more fool I. When I was at home I was in a better place. Now am I in Algiers, the more fool I," etc., etc. It is true that from my bedroom window in the Albany I cannot see the moon silvering the Mediterranean, or hear the soft swish of pepper trees. It is true that oranges and eucalyptus do not flourish in the Albany courtyard as they do in this hotel garden of Mustapha Superior. It is true that the blue African sky and sunshine are more agreeable than Piccadilly fogs. But after all, his own kennel is best for a dying dog, and his own familiar surroundings best for his declining hours. Again, Touchstone had not the faintest idea what he was going to do in the Forest of Arden, and I was equally ignorant of what would befall me when I landed at Algiers. He was bound on a fool adventure, and so was I. He preferred the easy way of home, and so do I. I have always loved Touchstone, but I have never thoroughly understood him till now. It rained persistently in Paris. It rained as I drove from the Gare du Nord to my hotel. It rained all night. It rained all the day I spent there, and it rained as I drove from my hotel to the Gare de Lyon. A cheery newspaper informed me that there was torrential rain at Marseille. I mentioned this to Rogers, who tried to console me by reminding me that we were only staying at Marseille for a few hours. "That has nothing to do with it," said I. "At Marseille I always eat bouillabaisse on the quay. Fancy eating it in the pouring rain." As usual, Rogers could not execute the imaginative exercise I prescribed, so he strapped my hold-all with an extra jerk. Now, when homespun London is wet and muddy, no one minds very much. But when silken Paris lies bedraggled with rain and mud, she is the forlornest thing under the sky. She is a hollow-eyed, pale city. The rouge is washed from her cheeks. Her hair hangs dank and dishevelled. In her aspect is desolation, and moaning is in her voice. I have a sultanesque feeling with regard to Paris. So long as she is amusing and gay, I love her. I adore her mirth, her chatter, her charming ways. But when she has the toothache and snivels, she bores me to death. I lose all interest in her. I want to clap my hands for my slaves, in order to bring me in something less dismal in the way of fair cities. I drove to the Rue Saint-Dominique and handed in my card and letter of introduction at the Ministère de la Guerre. I was received by the official in charge of the Bureau de Renseignement with bland politeness, tempered with suspicion that I might be taking a mental photograph of the office furniture in order to betray its secrets to a foreign government. After many comings and goings of orderlies and underlings, he told me very little in complicated and reluctant language. Captain Vauvenard had resigned his commission in the Chasseurs d'Afrique 2 years ago. At the present moment the Bureau had no information to give as to his domicile. "Have you no suggestion, monsieur, to offer," I asked, "whereby I may obtain this essential information concerning Captain Vauvenard?" "His old comrades in the regiment might know, monsieur." "And the regiment?" He opened the Annuaire officiel de l'armée française, just as I might have done myself, and said, "There are 6 regiments. One is at Blida, another at Tlemcen, another at Constantine, another at Tunis, another at Algiers, and another at Mascara." "To which regiment, then, did Captain Vauvenard belong?" I inquired. He referred to one of the dossiers that the orderlies had brought him. "The 3rd, monsieur." "I should get information, then, from Tlemcen?" "Evidently, monsieur." I thanked him and withdrew, to his obvious relief. Seekers after knowledge are unpopular even in organisations so far removed from the circumlocution office as the French Ministère de la Guerre. However, he had put me on the trail of my man. During my homeward drive through the rain I reflected. I might of course write to the Lieutenant-Colonel of the 3rd Regiment at Tlemcen and wait for his reply. But even if he answered by return of post, I should have to remain in Paris for nearly a week. "That," said I, wiping from my face half a teacupful of liquid mud which had squirted in through the cab window, "that I'll never do. I'll proceed at once to Algiers. If I can get no news of him there, I'll go to Tlemcen myself. In all probability I shall learn that he is residing here in Paris, a stone's throw from the Madeleine." So I started for Algiers. The next morning, before the sailing of the Maréchal Bugeaud, one of the quaint churns styled a steamship by the vanity of the French company which undertakes to convey respectable folk across the Mediterranean, I ate my bouillabaisse below an awning on the sunny quay at Marseille. The torrential rains had ceased. I advised Rogers to take equivalent sustenance, as no lunch is provided on day of sailing by the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique. I caught sight of him in a dark corner of the restaurant. He is too British to eat in the open air on the terrace, or perhaps too modest to have his meal in my presence, struggling grimly with a beefsteak, and as he is a teetotaler, with an unimaginable, horrific liquid, which he poured out from a vessel vaguely resembling a teapot. My meal over, and having nearly an hour to spare, I paid my bill, rose, and turned to the corner of the quay into the Canebière, thinking to have my coffee at one of the cafes in that thoroughfare of which the natives say that, if Paris had a Canebière, it would be a little Marseille. I suppose for the Marseillaise there is a magic in the sonorous name, for after all it is but a commonplace street of shops running from the quays into the heart of the town. It is also deformed by tramcars. I strolled leisurely up, thinking of the many swans that were geese, and paradises that were building plots, and heroes that were dummies, and solidities that were shadows. In short, enjoying a gentle post-prandial mood, when my eye suddenly fell on a scene which brought me down from such realities to the realm of the fantastic. There, a few yards in front of me, at the outer edge of the terrace of a cafe, clad in his eternal silk hat, frock coat, and yellow gloves, sat Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos, in earnest conversation with a seedy stranger of repellent mien. The latter was clean-shaven and had a broken nose, and wore a little, round, soft felt hat. The dwarf was facing me. As he caught sight of me, a smile of welcome overspread his Napoleonic features. He rose, awaited my approach, and, bareheaded, made his usual sweeping bow, which he concluded by resting his silk hat on the pit of his stomach. I lifted my hat politely and would have passed on, but he stood in my path. I extended my hand. He took it after the manner of a provincial mayor receiving royalty. "Courez-vous, monsieur, je vous en prie?" said I. He covered his head. "Monsieur," said he, "I beseech you to be seated and do me the honour of joining me in the coffee and excellent cognac of this establishment." "Willingly," said I, mindful of Lola's tale of the long knife which he carried concealed about his person. "Permit me to present my friend Monsieur Achille Soupiquet, Monsieur de Gex, a great English statesman and a friend of that acknowledged Engel, Madame Lola Brandt." Monsieur Soupiquet and I saluted each other formally. I took a seat. Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos moved a bundle of papers tied up with pink ribbon from in front of me, and ordered coffee and cognac. "Monsieur Soupiquet also knows Madame Brandt," he explained. "Bien sûr," said Monsieur Soupiquet. "She owes me 15 sous." Papadopoulos turned on him sharply. "Will you be silent?" The other grumbled beneath his breath. "I hope Madame is well," said Papadopoulos. I said that she appeared so when last I had the pleasure of seeing her. The dwarf turned to his friend. "Monsieur has also done my cats the honour of attending a rehearsal. He has seen Hephaestus, and his tears have dropped in sympathy over the irreparable loss of my beautiful Santa Bianca." "I hope the talented survivors," said I, "are enjoying their usual health." "My daily bulletin from my pupil and assistant caste contains excellent reports. A prosit, signore." It was only when I found myself at the table with the dwarf and his broken-nosed friend that I collected my wits sufficiently to realize the probable reason of his presence in Marseille. The grotesque little creature had actually kept his ridiculous word. He too had come south in search of the lost Captain Vauvenard. We were companions in the full adventure. There was something medieval in the combination, something legendary. Put back the clock a few centuries, and there we were, the knight and the dwarf, riding together on our quest, while the lady for whose sake we were making idiots of ourselves was twiddling her fair thumbs in her tower far beyond the seas. Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos broke upon this pleasing fancy by remarking again that Monsieur Soupiquet was a friend of Madame Brandt. "He was with her at the time of her great bereavement." "Bereavement?" I asked forgetfully. "Her horse, Sultan." He whispered the words with a solemn reverence. I must confess to being tired of the horse Sultan, and disinclined to treat his loss seriously. "Monsieur Soupiquet," said I, "doubtless offered her every consolation." "He used to travel with her and look after Sultan's well-being. He was her Master of the horse, I suggested. Precisely. You have the power of using the right word, Monsieur de Gex. It is a great gift. My good friend Sopiquet is attached to a circus at present stationed in Toulon. He came over at my request to see me on affairs of the deepest importance. He waved the bundle of papers. The very deepest importance. Nichois, Sopiquet? Bien sûr, murmured Sopiquet, who evidently did not count loquacity among his vices. I wondered whether these important affairs concerned the whereabouts of Captain Vauvenard, but the dwarf's air of mystery forbade my asking for his confidence. Besides, what should a groom in a circus know of retired captain of chasseurs? I said, "You're a very busy man, Monsieur le Professeur." He tapped his dope-like forehead. "I am never idle. I carry on here gigantic combinations. I should have been a lawyer. I can spread nets that no one sees, and then, psst, I draw the rope, and the victim is in the toils of Anastasius Papadopoulos. Hast du nicht das bemerkt, Sopiquet?" "Bien sûr," said Sopiquet again. He seemed perfectly conversant with the dwarf's polyglot jargon. "To the temperament of the artist," continued the modest Papadopoulos, "I join the intellect of the man of affairs and the heart of a young poet. I am always young. Yet, as you see me here, I am 37 years of age." He jumped from his chair and struck an attitude of the Apollo Belvedere. "I should never have thought that you were of the same age as a better person like myself," said I. "The secret of youth," he rejoined, sitting down again, "is enthusiasm, the worship of a woman, and intimate association with cats." Monsieur Sopiquet received this proposition without a gleam of interest manifesting itself in his dull blue eyes. His broken nose gave his face a singularly unintelligent expression. He poured out another glass of cognac from the graduated carafe in front of him, and sipped it slowly. Then he gazed at me dully, almost for the first time, and said, "Madame Brandt owes me 15 sous." "And I say that she doesn't," cried the dwarf fiercely. "I sent for him to discuss matters of the deepest gravity, and he comes talking about his 15 sous. I can't get anything out of him but his 15 sous. And the Carissima Signora doesn't owe it to him. She can't owe it to him. Voyons, Sopiquet, if you don't renounce your miserable pretensions, you will drive me mad. You will make me burst into tears. You will make me throw you out into the street and hold you down until you are run over by a tramcar. You will... He shook his fist passionately. He sought for a climatic menace. You will make me spit in your eye." He dashed his fist down on the marble table so that the glasses jingled. Sopiquet finished his cognac undisturbed. "I say that Madame Brandt owes me 15 sous, and until that is paid I do no business." The little man grew white with exasperation, and his upper lip lifted like an angry cat's, showing his teeth. I shrank from meeting Sopiquet's eye. Hurriedly I drew a providential handful of coppers from my pocket. "Stop, Herr Professor," said I, eager to prevent the shedding of tears, blood, and saliva. "Madame did mention to me an unacquitted debt in the south, and begged me to settle it for her. I am delighted to have the opportunity. Will you permit me to act as Madame's banker?" The dwarf at once grew suave and courteous. "The word of Carissima Signora is the word of God," said he. I solemnly counted out the 15 halfpence on the table and pushed them over to Sopiquet, who swept them up and put them in his pocket. "Now we can talk," said he. "Make him give you a receipt," cried Papadopoulos excitedly. "I know him. He's full of any treachery where money is concerned. He's capable of redemanding the sum from Madame Brandt. He is an ingrate. And she, Monsieur le Membre de Parlement Anglais, has overwhelmed him with benefits. Do you know what she did? She gave him the carcass of her beloved Sultan to dispose of. And he sold it, monsieur, and he got drunk on the money." The mingled emotions of sorrow at the demise of Sultan, the royal generosity of Madame Brandt, and the turpitude of his friend Sopiquet brought tears to the little man's eyes. Monsieur Sopiquet shrugged his shoulders unconcernedly. "A poor man has to get drunk when he can. It is only the rich who can get drunk when they like." I looked at my watch and rose in a hurry. "I'm afraid I must take an unceremonious leave of you, Monsieur le Professeur." "You must wait for the receipt," cried the dwarf. "Will you do me the honour of holding it for me until we meet again?" "Aye." interpolation was addressed to a cabman a few yards away. "Your conversation has made me neglect the flight of time. I shall only just catch my boat." "Your boat?" "I am going to Algiers." "Where will you be staying, monsieur? I ask in no spirit of vulgar curiosity." I raised a protesting hand, and with a smile named my hotel. "I arrived here from Algiers yesterday afternoon," he said, "and I proceed there again tomorrow." "I regret," said I, "that you are not coming today, so that I could have the pleasure of your company on the voyage." My polite formula seemed to delight Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos enormously. He made a series of the most complicated bows, to the joy of the waiters and the passers-by. I shook hands with him, and with the stolid Monsieur Sapiquet, and, waving my hat more like an excited Montenegrin than the most respectable of British valetudinarians, I drove off to the Quai de la Joliette, where I found an anxious but dogged Rogers in the midst of a vociferating crowd, literally holding the bridge that gave access to the Maréchal Beaugueux. "Thank heavens you've come, sir. You almost missed it. I couldn't have held out another minute." I, too, was thankful. If I had missed the boat, I should have had to wait till the next day, and crossed in the embarrassing and unrestful company of Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos. It is not that I dislike the little man, or have the Briton's nervous shrinking from being seen in eccentric society, but I wish to eliminate medievalism as far as possible from my quest. In conjunction with this crazy-headed little trainer of become too preposterous even for my light, sardonic humour, I resolved to dismiss him from my mind altogether. Yet in spite of my determination, and in spite of one of Monsieur Lenotre's fascinating monographs on the French Revolution, on which I had counted to beguile the tedium of my journey, I could not get Anastasius Papadopoulos out of my head. He stayed with me the whole of a storm-tossed night, and all the next morning. He's haunted my brain ever since. I see him tossing his arms about in fury, while the broken-nosed Sopiquet makes his monotonous claim for the payment of 7pence halfpenny. I hear him speak in broken whispers of the disastrous quadruped on whose skin and hoofs Sopiquet got drunk. I see him strutting about and boasting of his intellect. I see him taking leave of Lola Brandt and trotting magnificently out of the room, bent on finding Captain Vauvenard. He haunts my slumbers. I hope to goodness he will not take to haunting this delectable hotel. I wonder, after all, whether there is any method in his madness. For mad he is, as mad as can be. Why does he come backwards and forwards between Algiers and Marseille? What has Sopiquet to do with his quest? What revelation was he about to make on the payment of his 15 sous? It is all so grotesque, so out of relation with ordinary life. I feel inclined to go up to the retired colonels and elderly maiden ladies, who seem to form the majority of my fellow guests, and pinch them, and ask them whether they are real, or, like Papadopoulos and Sopiquet, the gentler creatures of a nightmare. Well, I have written to the Lieutenant-Colonel of the 3rd Regiment of Chasseurs at Tlemcen, which is away down by the Morocco frontier. I have also written to Lola Brandt. I seem to miss her as much as any of the friends I have left behind me in England. I cannot help the absurd fancy that her rich vitality helps me along. I have not been feeling quite so robust as I did when I saw her daily, and twinges are coming more frequently. I don't think that rolling about in the Mediterranean on board the Maréchal Beaugueux is good for little pains inside. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 11. When I began this autobiographical sketch of the last few weeks of my existence, I had conceived, as I have already said, the notion of making it chiefly a guide to conduct for my young disciple, Dale Kinnersley. Not only was it to explain to him clearly the motives which led to my taking any particular line of action with regard to his affairs, and so enable me to escape whatever blame he might, through misunderstanding, be disposed to cast on me, but also to elevate his mind, stimulate his ambitions, and improve his morals. It was to be a manual of humority. It was to be sweetened with philosophic reflections and adorned with allusions to the lives of the great masters of their destiny who had passed away. It was to have been a pretty little work after the manner of Montaigne, with the exception that it ran of its own accord into narrative form. But I'm afraid Lola Brandt has interposed herself between me and my design. She has brought me down from the serene philosophic plane where I could think and observe human happenings and analyse them and present them in their true aspect to my young friend. She has set me down in the thick of events, and not events such as the smiling philosopher is in the habit of dealing with, but lunatic, fantastic occurrences with which no system of philosophy invented by man is capable of grappling. I can just keep my head, that is all, and note down what happens more or less day by day, so that when the doing of dwarfs and captains and horse-tamers and youthful members of Parliament concern me no more, Dale Kinnersley can have a bald but veracious statement of fact. And, as I have before mentioned, he loves facts, just as a bear loves honey. I passed a quiet day or two in my hotel garden among the sweet peas and the roses and the geraniums. There were little shady summer-houses where one could sit and dream and watch the blue sky and the palms and the feathery pepper trees drooping with their coral berries, and the golden orange trees and the wisteria and the great gorgeous splash of purple bougainvillea above the Moorish arches of the hotel. There were mild little walks in the eucalyptus woods behind, where one went through acanthus and wild absinthe, and here and there, as the path wound, the great blue bay came into view, and far away the snow-capped peaks of the Atlas. There were warmth and sunshine, and the unexciting prattle of the retired colonels and maiden ladies. There was a hotel library filled with archaic fiction. I took out Ainsworth's Tower of London, and passed a happy morning in the sun, renewing the thrills of my childhood. I began to forget the outer world in my enchanted garden, like a knight in the forest of Brocéliande. Then came the letter from Plenken. The lieutenant colonel commanding the 3rd Regiment of Chasseurs d'Afrique had received my honoured communication, but regretted to say that he, together with all the officers of the regiment, had severed their connection with Captain Vauvenard, and that they were ignorant of his present address. This was absurd. A man doesn't resign from his regiment and within a year or two disappear like a ghost from the ken of every one of his brothers. I read the letter again. Did the severance of connection mean the casting out of a black sheep from their midst? I came to the conclusion that it did. They had washed their hands of Captain Vauvenard, and desired to hear nothing of him in the future. So I awoke from my lethargy, and springing up, sent not for my shield and spear, but from Indicateur des Chemins de Fer. I would go to Tlemcen and get to the bottom of it. I searched the timetable and found 2 trains, one starting from Algiers at 9:40 at night and getting into Tlemcen at noon next day, and one leaving at 6:50 in the morning and arriving at 10:30 at night. I groaned aloud. The dealing unto oneself a happy life and portion did not include abominable train journeys like these. I was trying to decide whether I should travel all day or all night, when the Arab chasseur of the hotel brought me a telegram. I opened it. It ran, "Starting for Algiers. Meet me. Lola." It was dispatched that morning from Victoria Station. I gazed at it stupidly. Why in the world was Lola Brandt coming to join me in Algiers? If she wanted to do her husband hunting on her own account, why had she put me to the inconvenience of my journey? Her action could not have been determined by my letter about Anastasius Papadopoulos, as a short calculation proved that it could not have reached her. I wandered round and round the garden paths, vainly seeking for the motive. Was it escape from Dale? Had she, woman-like, taken the step which she was so anxious to avoid, and in order to avoid taking which all this bother had arisen, and given the boy his dismissal? If so, why had she not gone to Paris, or St. Petersburg, or Tierra del Fuego? Why Algiers? Dale abandoned outright, the necessity for finding her husband had disappeared. Perhaps she was coming to request me on that account to give up the search. But Why travel across seas and continents when a telegram or a letter would have sufficed? She was coming at any rate, and as she gave no date, I presumed that she would travel straight through and arrive in about 48 hours. This reflection caused a gleam of sunshine to traverse my gloom. I was not physically capable of performing the journey to Tlemcen and back before her arrival. I could, therefore, dream among the roses of the garden for another couple of days. And when she came, perhaps she would like to go to Tlemcen herself and try the effect of her woman's fascinations on the lieutenant-colonel and officers of the 3rd Regiment of Chasseurs d'Afrique. In any case, her sudden departure argued well for Dale's liberation. If the rupture had occurred, I was quite contented. That is what I had wished to accomplish. It only remained now to return to London, while breath yet stayed in my body, and lead him diplomatically to the feet of Maisie Ellerton. Then I would have ended my humorous task, and my last happy words would be a paternal benediction. But all the same, I went forth to find this confounded captain, and did not want to be hindered. The sportsman's instinct, which, in my robust youth, had led me to crawl miles on my belly over wet heather in order to get a shot at a stag, I found, somewhat to my alarm, was urging me on this chase after Captain Vauvenard. He was my quarry. I resented interference. Deer-stalking then, and man-stalking now, I wanted no petticoats in the party. I worked myself up into an absurd state of irritability. Why was she coming to spoil the sport? I had arranged to track her husband down, reason with him, work on his feelings, telegraph for his wife, and in an affecting interview throw them into each other's arms. Now, goodness knows what would happen. Certainly not my beautifully conceived coup de théâtre. And she has the impertinence, I cried in my wrath, to sign herself Lola. As if I ever called her, or could ever be in a position to call her Lola. I should like to know, I exclaimed, hurling the indicateur des chemins de fer onto the seat of a summer-house built after the manner of a little Greek temple. I should like to know what the deuce she means by it. "Hello, hello, what the devil's the matter?" cried a voice, and I found I had disturbed from his slumbers an unnoticed colonel of British cavalry. "A thousand pardons," said I. "I thought I was alone, and gave vent to the feelings of the moment." Colonel Bunyan stretched himself and joined me. "That's the worst of this place," he said. "It's so liverish. One lolls about and sleeps all day long, and one's liver gets like a Strasbourg goose's and plays old Harry with one's temper. Why won't you come here when there are pheasants to be shot in England? I don't know." "Neither your liver nor your temper seem to be much affected, Colonel," said I, "for you've been violently awakened from a sweet sleep, and are in a most amiable frame of mind." He laughed, suggested exercise, the Briton's panacea for all ills, and took me for a walk. When we returned at dusk, and after I had had tea before the fire, for December evenings in Algiers are chilly, in one of the pretty Moorish alcoves of the lounge, my good humour was restored. I viewed our pursuit of Captain Vauvenard in its right aspect, that of a veritable snark hunt of which I was the bellman, and the name Lola curled itself round my heart with the same grateful sensation of comfort as the warm China tea. After all, it was only as Lola that I thought of her. The name fitted her personality, which Brandt did not. Out of Brandt I defy you to get any curvilinear suggestion. I reflected dreamily that it would be pleasant to walk with her among the roses in the sunshine, and to drink tea with her in dusky Moorish alcoves. I also thought, with an enjoyable spice of malice, of what the retired colonels and elderly maiden ladies would have to say about Lola when she arrived. They should have a gorgeous time. So light-hearted did I become that the next evening, while I was dressing for dinner, I did not frown when the chasseur brought me up the huge trilingual visiting card of Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos. "Show the gentleman up," said I. Rogers handed me my black tie and began to gather together discarded garments so as to make the room tidy for the visitor. It was a comfortable bed-sitting room, with a bed in an alcove and a tiny dressing-room attached. A wood fire burned on the hearth, on each side of which was an arm-chair. Presently there came a knock at the door. Rogers opened it and admitted Papadopoulos, who forthwith began to execute his usual manoeuvres of salutation. Rogers stood staring and open-mouthed at the apparition. It took all his professional training in imperturbability to enable him to make a decent exit. This increased my good humour. I grasped the dwarf's hand. "My dear Professor, I am delighted to see you. Pray excuse my receiving you in this unceremonious fashion, and sit down by the fire." I hastily completed my toilette by stuffing my watch, letter-case, loose change, and handkerchief into my pockets, and took a seat opposite him. "It is I," said he politely, "who must apologize for this untimely call. I have wanted to pay my respects to you since I arrived in Algiers, but till now I have had no opportunity." "Allow me," said I, "to disembarrass you of your hat." I took the high-crowned, flat-brimmed thing which he was nursing somewhat nervously on his knees, and put it on the table. He murmured that I was "sehr aimable." "And the charming Monsieur Soupiquet, how is he?" I asked. He drew out his gilt-embossed pocket-book, and from it extracted an envelope. "This," said he, handing it to me, "is the receipt. I have to thank you again for regulating the debt, as it has enabled me to transact with Monsieur Soupiquet the business on which I summoned him from Toulon. He is the most obstinate, pig-headed camel that ever lived, and I believe he has returned to Toulon in the best of health. No, thank you," he added, refusing my offer of cigarettes. "I don't smoke. It disturbs the perfect adjustment of my nerves, and so imperils my gigantic combinations. It is also distasteful to my cats." "You must miss them greatly," said I. He sighed. Then his face lit up with inspiration. "Ah, Signor, what one would not sacrifice for an idea, for duty, for honour, for the happiness of those we love." "Those are sentiments, Monsieur Papadopoulos," I remarked, "which do you infinite credit." "And therefore I express them, sir," he replied, "to show you what manner of man I am." He paused for a moment. Then, bending forward, his hands on his little knees — he was sitting far back in the chair, and his legs were dangling like a child's — he regarded me intently. "Would you be equally chivalrous for the sake of an idea?" I replied that I hoped I should conduct myself en galant homme in any circumstances. "I knew it," he cried. "My intuition is never wrong. An English statesman is as fearless as Agamemnon and as wise as Nestor. Have you your evening free?" "Yes," I replied wonderingly. "Would you care to devote it to a perilous adventure? Not so perilous, for I," he thumped his chest, "will be there, but still molto gefährlich." His black eyes held mine in burning intensity. So as to hide a smile, I lit a cigarette. I know not what little imp in motley possessed me that evening. He seemed to hit me over the head with his bladder, and counsel me to play the fool like himself, for once in my life, before I died. I could almost hear him speaking. "Sure, crazy dwarf out of a nightmare is more entertaining company than decayed colonels of British cavalry." I blew 2 or 3 puffs of my cigarette and met my guest's eager gaze. "I shall be happy to put myself at your disposal," said I. "May I ask, without indiscretion—" No, he interrupted, "don't ask. Secrecy is part of the gigantic combination. En galant homme, I require of you confidence." With an irresistible touch of mockery, I said, "Professor Papadopoulos, I will be happy to follow you blindfold to the lair of whatever fire-breathing dragon you may want me to help you destroy." He rose and grasped his hat and made me a profound bow. "You will not find me wanting in courage, monsieur. There is another small favour I would ask of you. Will you bring some of your visiting cards?" "With pleasure," said I. At that moment the gong clanged loudly through the hotel. "Ah, it is your dinner hour," said the dwarf. "I depart. A rendezvous." "Let us have no rendezvous, my dear Professor," I interposed. "What more simple than that you should do me the pleasure of dining with me here? We can thus fortify ourselves with food and drink for our adventure, and we can start on it comfortably together whenever it seems good to you." The little man put his head on one side and looked at me in an odd way. Do you mean, he asked in a softened voice, that you asked me to dine with you in the midst of your aristocratic compatriots? Why, evidently, said I, baffled. It's only an ordinary table d'hôte dinner. To my astonishment, tears actually spurted out of the eyes of the amazing little creature. He took my hand, and before I knew what he was going to do with it, he had touched it with his lips. My dear Professor, I cried in dismay. He put up a pudgy hand and said with great dignity, I cannot dine with you, Monsieur de Gex, but I thank you from my heart for your generous kindness. I shall never forget it to my dying day. But he would listen to no protests. If you will do me the honour of coming at 9 o'clock to the Café de Bordeaux at the corner of the Place du Gouvernement, I shall be there. Auf Wiedersehen, monsieur, and 1,000 thanks. I beg you as a favour not to accompany me. I couldn't bear it. And, drawing a great white handkerchief from his pocket, he wiped his eyes, blew his nose, and disappeared like a flash through the door which I held open for him. I went down to dinner in a chastened mood. The little man had not shown me before the pathetic side of the freak's life. By asking him to dinner as if he were normal, I had earned his eternal gratitude. And yet, with a smile, while I trust the recording angel when he makes up my final balance sheet of good and evil will not ascribe to an unfeeling heart, I could not help formulating the hope that his gratitude would not be shown by presents of china fowls sitting on eggs, Tyrolese chalets, and bottles with ladders and little men inside them. I did not feel within me the wide charity of Lola Brandt, and I could not repress a smile, as I ate my solitary meal, at the perils of the adventure to which I was invited. I had no doubt that it bore the same relation to danger as Monsieur Soupiquet's 7pence halfpenny bore to a serious debt. Colonel Bunyan, a genial little red-faced man with bulgy eyes and a moustache too big for his body, who sat, also solitary, at the next table to mine, suddenly began to utter words which I discovered were addressed to me. Most amazing thing happened to me as I was coming down to dinner. Just got out of the corridor to the foot of the stairs when down rushed something about 3 foot nothing in a devil of a top hat and butted me full in the pit of the stomach and bounded off like a football. When I picked it up, I found it was a man. Give me my word, it was a man. About so high, gave me quite a turn. That, said I with a smile, was my friend Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos. A friend of yours? He had just been calling on me. I wish you'd entreat him not to go downstairs like a 6-inch shell. I'll have a bruise tomorrow where the crown of his hat caught me as big as a soup plate. I offered the cheerily indignant warrior apologies for my friend's parabolic method of descent, and suggested Edmund's embrication. The most extraordinary part of it, he interrupted, was that when I picked him up he was weeping like anything. What was he crying about? He is a sensitive creature, said I, and he doesn't come upon the pit of the stomach of a colonel of British cavalry every day of the week. He sniffed uncertainly at the remark for a second or two, and then broke into a laugh and asked me to play bridge after dinner. On the 2 preceding evenings he and I had attempted to cheer, in this manner, the desolation of a couple of the elderly maiden ladies. But I may say, parenthetically, that as he played bridge as if he were leading a cavalry charge according to a textbook on tactics, and as I played card games in a soft mental twilight, and as the 2 ladies were very keen bridge players indeed, I had great doubts as to the success of our attempts. "I'm sorry," said I, "but I'm going down into the town tonight." "Theatre? If so, I'll go with you." The gallant gentleman was always at a loose end, and if he could persuade another human being to do something with him, no matter what, he would joyfully have played cat's cradle with me by the hour. He sat in awful boredom, meditating on his liver. "I'm not going to the theatre," I said, "and I wish I could ask you to accompany me on my adventure." The colonel raised his eyebrows. I laughed. "I'm not going to twang guitars out of balconies." The colonel reddened and swore he had never thought of such a thing. He was a perjured villain, but I did not tell him so. "In what my adventures will consist, I can't say," I remarked. If you're going to fool about Algiers at night, you'd better carry a revolver. I told him I did not possess such deadly weapons. He offered to lend me one. The two Mrs. Bostock from South Shields, who sat at the table within earshot and had been following our conversation, manifested signs of excited interest. "I shall be quite protected," said I, "by the dynamic qualities of my acquaintance, Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos, with whom I have promised to spend the evening." "You'd better have the revolver," said the Colonel, and so bent was he on the point that after dinner he came to me in the lounge and laid a loaded six-shooter beside my coffee-cup. The younger Miss Bostock grew pale. It looked an ugly, cumbrous, devastating weapon. "My dear Colonel," I protested, it's against the law to carry firearms." "Law? What law?" "Why, the law of France," said I. This staggered him. The fact of there being decent laws in foreign parts has staggered many an honest Briton. He counselled a damnation of the law. Finally, in order to humour him, I allowed him to thrust the uncomfortable thing into my hip pocket. "Colonel," said I, when I took leave of him an hour later, "I've armed myself out of pure altruism. I shan't be able to sit down in peace and comfort for the rest of the evening. Should I accidentally do so, my blood will be on your head." End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 12. The tram that passes the hotel gates took me into the town and dropped me at the Place du Gouvernement. With its strange fusion of east and west, its great white-domed mosque flanked by the tall minaret, contrasting with its formal French colonnaded facades, its groupings of majestic white-robed forms and commonplace figures in caps and hard felt hats, the mystery of its palm trees, and the crudity of its flaring electric lights, it gave an impression of unreality, of a modern contractor's idea of fairyland, where anything grotesque might assume an air of normality. The moon shone full in the heavens, and as I crossed the Place, I saw the equestrian statue of the Duke of Orleans silhouetted against the mosque. The port to the east was quiet at this hour, and the shipping lay dreamily in the moonlight. Far away one could see the dim outlines of the Kabyle mountains, and the vague melting of sea and sky into a near horizon. The undefinable smell of the east was in the air. The Café de Bordeaux, which forms an angle of the Place, blazed in front of me. A few hardy souls, a Zouave or two, an Arab, a bored Englishman and his wife, and some French inhabitants, were sitting outside in the chilliness. I entered. The café was filled with a nondescript crowd, and the rattle of dominoes rose above the hum of talk. In a corner near the door I discovered the top of a silk hat projecting above a widely opened newspaper grasped by two pudgy hands, and I recognized the Professor. "Monsieur," said he, when I had taken a seat at his table, "if the unknown terrors which you are going to confront dismay you, I beg that you will not consider yourself bound to me." "My dear Professor," I replied, "a brave man tastes of death but once." He was much delighted at the sentiment which he took to be original. "I shall quote it," said he, "whenever my honour or my courage is called into question. It is not often that a man has the temerity to do so. Can I have the honour of offering you a whisky and soda?" "Have we time?" I asked. "We have time," he said, solemnly consulting his watch. "Things will ripen." "Then," said I shall have much pleasure in drinking to their maturity." While we were drinking our whisky and soda, he talked volubly of many things, his travels, his cats, his own incredible importance in the cosmos. And as he sat there vapouring about the pathetically insignificant, he looked more like Napoleon III than ever. His eyes had the same mournful depths, his features the same stamp of fatality. Each man has his gigantic combinations, perhaps equally important in the eyes of the high gods. I was filled with an immense pity for Napoleon III. Of the object of the adventure he said nothing. As secrecy seemed to be a vital element in his 15-cent scheme, I showed no embarrassing curiosity. Indeed, I felt but little, though I was certain that the adventure was connected with the world-cracking revelations of Monsieur Sopiquet, and was undertaken in the interest of his beloved lady, Lola Brandt. But it was like playing at pirates with a child, and my pity for Napoleon gave place to my pity for my valiant but childish little friend. At last he looked at his watch. "The hour is struck. Let us proceed." Instinctively I summoned the waiter and drew a coin from my pocket, and when the grown-up person and the small boy hobnob together, the former pays. But Anastasius, with a swift look of protest, anticipated my intention. I was his guest for the evening. I yielded apologetically, the score was paid, and we went forth into the moonlight. He led me across the Place du Gouvernement and struck straight up the hill past the cathedral, and turning plunged into a network of narrow streets where the poor of all races lived together in amity and evil odours. Shops chiefly occupied the ground floors. Some were the ordinary humble shops of Europeans, others were caves lit by a smoky lamp, where Arabs lounged and smoked around the tailors or cobblers squatting at their work. Others were Jewish, with Hebrew inscriptions. There were dark Arab cafes, noisy Italian wine shops, butchers' stalls. Children of all ages played and screamed about the precipitous, cobble-paved streets, and the shrill cries of Jewish women sitting at their doors rose in rebuke of husband or offspring. Not many lights appeared through the shuttered windows of the dark, high houses. Overhead, between two facades, one saw a strip of paleness which one knew was the moonlit sky. Conversation with my companion being difficult, the top of his silk hat just reached my elbow, I strode along in silence, Anastasius trotting by my side. Many jeers and jests were flung at us as we passed, whereat he scowled terribly, but no one molested us. I am inclined to think that Anastasius attributed this to fear of his fierce demeanour. If so, he was happy, as were the simple souls who flouted, and this reflection kept my mind serene. Presently we turned into a wide and less poverty-stricken street, which I felt sure we could have reached by a less tortuous and malodorous path. A few yards down we came to a dark porte-cochere. The dwarf halted, crossed, so as to read the number by the gas lamp, and joining me said, "It is here. Have you your visiting cards ready?" I nodded. We proceeded down the dark entry till we came to a slovenly, ill-kept glass box lit by a small gas jet, whence emerged a slovenly, ill-kept man. This was the concierge. Anastasius addressed a remark to him which I did not catch. "Au fond de la cour, troisième à gauche," said the concierge. As yet there seemed to be nothing peculiarly perilous about the adventure. We crossed the cobble-paved courtyard and mounted an evil-smelling stone staircase, blackened here and there by the occasional gas jets. On the third landing we halted. Anastasius put up his hand and gripped mine. "Two strong men together," said he, "need fear nothing." I confess my only fear was lest the confounded revolver, which swung insecurely in my hip pocket, might go off of its own accord. I did not mention this to my companion. He raised his hat, wiped his brow, and rang the bell. The door opened about 6 inches, and a man's dark mustachioed face appeared. "Vous désirez, monsieur?" As I had not the remotest idea what we desired, I let Anastasius be spokesman. "Here is an English milord," said Anastasius boldly, "who would like to be admitted for the evening to the privileges of the club." "Enter, gentlemen," said the man, who appeared to be the porter. We found ourselves in a small vestibule. In front of us was a large door, on the right a small one, both closed. At a table by the large door sat a dirty, out-of-elbows raven of a man reading a newspaper. The latter looked up and addressed me. "You wish to enter the club, monsieur?" I had no particular longing to do so, but I politely answered that such was my desire. "If you will give your visiting card, I will submit it to the secretariat." I produced my card. Anastasius thrust a pencil into my hand. "Write my name on it, too." I obeyed. The raven sent the porter with the card into the room on the right, and resumed the perusal of his soiled newspaper. I looked at Anastasius. The little man was quivering with excitement. The porter returned after a few minutes with a couple of pink oval cards, which he handed to each of us. I glanced at mine. On it was inscribed, Cercle Africain d'Alger, carte de membre honoraire, une soirée. And then there was a line for the honorary member's signature. The raven man dipped a pen in the ink pot in front of him and handed it to me. "Will you sign, monsieur?" We executed this formality. He retained the cards, and, opening the great door, he said, "Entrez, monsieur." The door closed behind us. It was simply a tripot, or gambling den. And all this solemn farce of secretariats and carte d'entrée to obtain admission. It is curious how the bureaucratic instinct is ingrained in the French character. It was a large, ill-ventilated room, blue with cigarette and cigar smoke. Some 30 men were standing around a baccarat table in the centre, and 2 or 3 groups hung around écarté tables in the corners. A personage who looked like a slightly more prosperous brother of the raven outside, and wore a dinner jacket, promenaded the room with the air of one in authority. He scrutinized us carefully from a distance, then advanced and greeted us politely. "You have chosen an excellent evening," said he. "There are a great many people, and the banks are large." He bowed and passed on. A dingy waiter took our hats and coats and hung them up. Anastasius plucked me by the sleeve. "If you don't mind staking a little for the sake of appearances, I shall be grateful." I whispered, "Can you tell me now, my dear Professor, for what reason you brought me to this gaming hell?" He looked up at me out of his mournful eyes and murmured, "Patience, libéraire." Then, spying a vacant place behind the chairs at the baccarat table, he darted thither, and I followed in his wake. There must have been about a couple of hundred louis in the bank, which was held by a dissipated, middle-aged man, who, having once been handsome in a fleshy way, had run to fat. His black hair, cropped short, stood up like a shoe-brush, and when he leaned back in his chair, a roll of flesh rose about his collar. I disliked the fellow for his unhealthiness and for the hard mockery in his puffy eyes. The company seemed fairly homogeneous in its raffishness, though here and there appeared a thin, aristocratic face, with grey moustache and pointed beard, and the homely, anxious visage of a small tradesman. But in bulk it looked an ugly, seedy crowd, with unwashed bodies and unclean souls. I noticed an Italian or two, and a villainous Englishman with a face like that of a dilapidated horse. A glance at the table plastered with silver and gold showed me that they were playing with a 5-franc minimum. Anastasius drew a handful of louis from his pocket and staked one. I staked a 5-franc piece. The cards were dealt, the banker exposed a 9, the highest number, and the croupier's flat spoons swept the table. A murmur arose. The banker was having the luck of Satan. "He always protects me, the good fellow," laughed the banker, who had overheard the remark. Again we staked. Again the hands were dealt. Our tableau, or end of the table, won. The other lost. The croupier threw the coins in payment. I let my double stake lie, and so did Anastasius. At the next coup we lost again. The banker stuffed his winnings into his pocket and declared a suite. The bank was put up at auction and was eventually knocked down to the same personage for 50 louis. The horse-headed Englishman cried, "Banco!" which means that he would play the banker for the whole amount. The hands were dealt, the Englishman lost, and the game started afresh with 100 louis in the bank. The proceedings began to bore me. Even if my experience of life had not suggested that scrupulous fairness and honour were not the guiding principles of such an assemblage, I should have taken little interest in the game. I am a great believer in the wholesomeness of compounding for sins you are inclined to by damning those you have no mind to. It aids the nice balance of life, and gambling is one of the sins I delight to damn. The rapid getting of money has never appealed to me, who have always had sufficient for my moderately Epicurean needs, and least of all did it appeal to me now, when I was on the brink of my journey to the land where French gold and banknotes were not in currency. I repeat, therefore, that I was bored. "If the perils of the adventure don't begin soon, my dear Professor," I whispered, "I shall go to sleep standing." Again he asked for patience and staked a 100-franc note. At that moment the man sitting at the table in front of him rose, and the dwarf slipped swiftly into his seat. He won his 100 francs, and made the same stake again. It was obvious that the little man did not damn gambling. It was a sin to which he appeared peculiarly inclined. The true inwardness of the perilous adventure began to dawn on me. He had come here to make the money wherewith he could further his gigantic combinations. All this mystery was part of his childish cunning. I hardly knew whether to box the little creature's ears, to box my own, or to laugh. I compromised with a smile on the last alternative, and baccarat being a dreary game to watch, I strolled off to the nearest écarté table, and, to justify my presence in the room, backed one of the players. Presently my attention was called to the baccarat table by a noise of some dispute, and turning, I saw the gentleman in the dinner jacket hurrying to what appeared to be the storm centre, the place where Anastasius was sitting. Suspecting some minor peril, I left the écarté players and joined the gentleman in the dinner jacket. It seemed that the hand, which is played in rotation by those seated at each tableau or half-table, had come round for the first time to Anastasius. An objection had been taken to his playing it, on the score of his physical appearance. The dwarf was protesting vehemently. He played baccarat in all the clubs of Europe, and had never received such treatment. It was infamous, it was insulting. The malcontents of the punt paid little heed to his remonstrances. They resented the entrusting of their fortunes to one whose chin barely rose above the level of the table. The banker lit a cigarette and sat back in his chair with a smile of mockery. His attitude brought up the superfluous flesh about his chin and the roll of fat at the back of his neck. With his moustache en croque and his shoebrush hair, I have rarely beheld a more sensual-looking desperado. "But, gentlemen," said he, "I see no objection whatever to monsieur playing the hand." "Naturally," reported a voice, "since it would be to your advantage." The raven in the dinner jacket commanded silence. "Gentlemen, I declare that according to the rules of the game, monsieur is entitled to play the hand." "Bravo!" exclaimed one or two of my friend's supporters. "C'est idiot!" growled the malcontents. "Monsieur, faites vos jeux!" cried the croupier. The stakes were laid. The banker looked around, estimated the comparative values of the two tableaux. Anastasius had backed his hand with a pile of louis. To encourage him, and to conciliate the hostile punt, I threw down a 100-franc note. "Les jeux sont faits? Rien ne va plus?" The banker dealt 2 cards to each tableau, 2 to himself. Anastasius, trembling with nervous excitement, stretched out a palsied little fist towards the cards. He drew them towards him, face downwards, peeped at them in the most approved manner, and in a husky voice called for an extra card. The card, dealt face upwards, was a 5. The banker turned up his 2 cards, a 2 and a 4, making a point of 6. Naturally he stood. Anastasius did nothing. "Show your cards! Show your cards!" cried several voices. He turned over the 2 cards originally dealt to him. They were a king and a 9, making the natural 9 the highest point, and he had actually asked for another card. It was the unforgivable sin. The 5 that had been dealt to him brought his point to 4. There was a roar of indignation. Men with violent faces rose and cursed him and shook their fists at him. Others clamoured that the coup was ineffective. They were not going to be at the mercy of an idiot who knew nothing of the game. The hand must be dealt over again. "Jamais de la vie!" shouted the banker. "Le coup est bon!" cried the raven in authority, and the croupier's spoon hovered over the table. But the horse-headed Englishman clutched the 2 louis he had staked. He was damned, and a great many other things, if he would lose his money that way. The raven in the dinner jacket darted round, and bending over him, caught him by the wrist. 2 or 3 others grabbed their stakes and swore they would not pay. The banker rose and went to the rescue of his gains. There was screaming and shouting and struggling and riot indescribable. Those round about us went on cursing Anastasius, who sat quite still, with quivering lips, as helpless as a rabbit. The raven tore his way through the throng around the Englishman, came up to me, excited and dishevelled. "It is all your fault, monsieur," he shrieked, "for introducing into the club a half-witted creature like that." "Yes, it's your fault," cried a low-browed, ugly fellow looking like a butcher in uneasy circumstances, who stood next to me. Suddenly the avalanche of indignation fell upon my head. Angry, ugly men crowded round me and began to curse me instead of the dwarf. Cries arose. The adventure began indeed to grow idiotically perilous. I had never been thrown out of doors in my life. I objected strongly to the idea. It might possibly hurt my body, and would certainly offend my dignity. I felt that I could not make my exit through the portals of life with the urbanity on which I counted, if, as a preparatory step, I had been thrown out of a gambling hell. There were only two things to be done. Either I must whip out my ridiculous revolver and do some free shooting, or I must make an appeal to the lower feelings of the assembly. I chose the latter alternative. With a sudden movement I slipped through the angry and gesticulating crowd and leaped on a chair by one of the deserted écarté tables. Then I raised a commanding arm, and in my best election-meeting voice I cried, "Monsieur!" The unexpectedness of the manoeuvre caused instant silence. "As my friend and myself," I said, "are the cause of this unpleasant confusion, I shall be most happy to pay the banker the losses of the tableau." And I drew out and brandished my pocket-book, in which, by a special grace of Providence, there happened to be a considerable sum of money. Murmurs of approbation arose. Then the Englishman sang out, "But what about the money we would have won if that little fool had played the game properly?" The remark was received with cheers. "That amount too," said I shall be happy to disburse." There was nothing more to be said, as everybody, banker and punt, was satisfied. The raven in the dinner jacket came up and informed me that my proposal solved the difficulty. I besought him to make out the bill for my little entertainment as quickly as possible. Then I dismounted from my chair and beckoned to the dwarf, still sitting white and piteous, to join me. He obeyed, like a frightened child who has been naughty. All his swagger and braggadocio was gone. His bosom heaved with suppressed sobs. He sat down on the chair I had vacated and buried his face on the écarté table. We remained thus aloof from the crowd, who were intent on the calculation of the baccarat table. At last the raven in the dinner jacket arrived with a note of the amount. It was 2,300 francs. I gave him the notes, and, taking Anastasius by the arm, led him to the door, where the waiter stood with our hats and coats. Before we could reach it, however, the banker, who had risen from his seat, crossed the room and addressed me. "Monsieur," said he, with an air of high-bred courtesy, "I infinitely regret this unpleasant affair, and I thank you for your perfect magnanimity." I did not suggest that with equal magnanimity he might refund the £46 that had found its way from my pocket to his. But I bowed with stiff politeness, and made my exit with as much dignity as the attachments my feels of the crestfallen Anastasius would permit. Outside, I constituted myself the guide, and took the first turning downhill, knowing that it would lead to the civilized centre of the town. The dwarf's roundabout route was characteristic of his tortuous mind. We walked along for some time without saying anything. I could not find it in my heart to reproach the little man for the expensiveness, nearly £100, of his perilous adventure, and he seemed too dazed with shame and humiliation to speak. At last, when we reached, as I anticipated, the Square de la République, I patted him on the shoulder. "Cheer up, my dear Professor," said I. "We both are acquainted with nobler things and the ins and outs of gambling hells." He reeled to a bench under the palm trees, and, bursting into tears, gave vent to his misery in the most incoherent language ever uttered by man. I sat beside him and vainly attempted consolation. "Ah, how mad I am, how contemptible! I dare not face my beautiful cats again, I dare not see the light of the sun. I have betrayed my trust. Accursed be the cards. I who had my gigantic combination, it is all gone. Beautiful lady, forgive me. Generous-hearted friend, forgive me. I am the most miserable of God's creatures." "It is an accident that might happen to anyone," I said gently. "You were nervous. You looked at the cards, you mistook the 9 for a 10, in which case you were right to call for another card." "It is not that," he wailed. "It is the spoiling of my combination, on which I have wasted sleepless nights, a curse on my mad folly. Do you know who the banker was?" No, said I. He was Captain Vauvenard, the husband of Madame Brandt. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 13. You could have knocked me down with a feather. It is a trite metaphor, I know, but it is none excellent. I repeat, therefore, unblushingly, you could have knocked me down with a feather. I gasped. The little man wiped his eyes. He was the tearfullest adult I have ever met, and I once knew an Italian prima donna with a temperament. Captain Vauvenard, the man with the shoebrush hair and the rolls of fat at the back of his neck, are you sure? The dwarf nodded. I set out from England to find him. I swore to the carissima signora that I would do so. I have done it, he added, with a faint return of his self-confidence. Well, I'm damned, said I in my native tongue. I don't often use strong language, but the occasion warranted it. I was flabbergasted, bewildered, outraged, humiliated, delighted, incredulous, and generally turned topsy-turvy. In conversation one has no time for so minute an analysis of one's feelings. I will sum them up in the only word. Captain Vauvenard, the wild goose of my absurd chase, found by this flipperty-gibbet of a fellow, while I, Simon de Gex, erstwhile MP, was fooling about war offices and regiments. It was grotesque, it was monstrous, it ought not to have been allowed, and yet it saved me a vast amount of trouble. I'm damned, said I. Anastasius had just enough English to understand. I suppose, such is mortal ignorancy, that it is the most widely understood word in the universe. And I, said he, am eternally beaten. I am trampled underfoot and shall never be able to hold up my head again. Whereupon he renewed his lamentations. For some time I listened patiently, and from his disconnected remarks I gathered that he had gone to the Cercle Africain in view of his gigantic combinations, but that the demon of gambling taking possession of him had almost driven them from his mind. Eventually he had lost control of his nerves, a cloud had spread over his brain, and he had committed the unspeakable blunder which led to disaster. To think that I should have tracked him down for this, he exclaimed tragically. What beats me, I cried, is how the deuce you managed to track him down. Your magnificent intellect, I suppose. I spoke gently and not in open sarcasm, enabled you to get on the trail. He brightened at the compliment. Yes, that was it. Listen, I came to Algiers, the last place he was heard of. I go to the cafes. I listen like a detective to conversation. I creep behind soldiers talking. I find out nothing. I ask at the shops. They think I am crazy, but Anastasius Papadopoulos has a brain larger than theirs. I go to my old friend, the secretary of the theatre, where I have exhibited the marvellous performance of my cats. I say to him, When have you a date for me? He says, Next year. I make a note of it. We talk. He knows all Algiers. I say to him, What has become of Captain Vauvenard of the Chasseurs d'Afrique? I say it carelessly, as if the captain were an old friend of mine. The secretary laughs. Haven't you heard the captain was chased from the regiment? The deuce he was, I dejected. On account of something, said Anastasius. The secretary could not tell what. Perhaps he cheated at cards. The officers said so. Where is he now? I asked. Why, in Algiers. He is the most famous gambler in the town. He is every night at the Cercle Africain, and some people believe that it belongs to him. My friend the secretary asked me why I am so anxious to discover Captain Vauvenard. I do not betray my secret. When I do not wish to talk, I close my lips, and they are sealed like the tomb. I am the model of discretion. You, monsieur, with the high-bred delicacy of the English statesman, have not questioned me about my combination. I appreciate it. But if you had, though it broke my heart, I should not have answered. I am not going to pry into your schemes, I said, but there are one or two things I must understand. How do you know the banker was Captain Vauvenard? I saw him terrible times in Marseille with the carissima signora. Then how was it he did not recognize you tonight? I was then but an acquaintance of Madame, not her intimate friend, counsellor, champion, as I am now. I did not have the honour of being presented to Captain Vauvenard. I went tonight to make sure of my man, to play the first card in my gigantic combination, but alas, but no." He rose and thumped his little chest. "I feel my courage coming back. My will is stiffening into iron. When the Carissima Signora arrives in Algiers, she will find she has a champion." "How do you know she's coming to Algiers?" I asked, startled. "As soon as I learned that Captain Vauvenard was here," he replied proudly, "I sent her a telegram. 'Husband found, come at once.' I know she is coming, for she has not answered." An idea occurred to me. "Did you sign your name and address on the telegram?" He approached me confidentially as I sat, and wagged a cunning finger. "In matters of life and death, never give your name and address." As Professor Anastasius Papadopoulos was himself again, and as I began to sneeze, for the night was chilly, I rose and suggested that we might adjourn this conference till the morrow. He acquiesced, saying that all was not lost, and that he still had time to mature his combinations. We crossed the road, and I hailed a cab standing by the Café d'Alger. I offered Anastasius to drive him to his hotel, but he declined politely. We shook hands. "Monsieur," said he, "I have to make my heartfelt apologies for having caused you so painful, so useless, and so expensive an evening. As for the last aspect, I will repay you." "You will do no such thing, Professor," said I. "My evening has, on the contrary, been particularly useful and instructive. I have missed it for the world." And I drove off homewards, glad to be in my own company. Here was an imbroglio. The missing husband found, and, like most missing husbands, found to be entirely undesirable. And Lola, obviously imagining her summons to be from me, was at that moment speeding hither as fast as the Maréchal Bugeaud could carry her. If I had discovered Captain Vauvenard instead of Anastasius, I would have anathematized him as the most meddlesome, crazy little marplot that ever looked like Napoleon III. But as the credit of the discovery belonged to him and not to me, I could only anathematize myself for my dilettantism in the capacity of a private inquiry agent. I went to bed and slept badly. The ludicrous scenes of the evening danced before my eyes. The smoke-filled, sordid room, the ignoble faces round the table, the foolish hullabaloo, the collapse of Anastasius, my melodramatic intervention, and the ironical courtesy of the fleshly Captain Vauvenard. Also, in the small hours of the night, Anastasius' gigantic combinations assumed a less trivial aspect. What lunatic scheme was being hatched behind that dome-like brow? His object in taking me to the club was obvious. He couldn't have got in save under my protection. But what had he reckoned upon doing when he got there? Heaven and Anastasius Papadopoulos only knew. I was also worried by the confounded little pain inside. On the following afternoon I went down to meet the steamer from Marseille. I more than expected to find the dwarf on the quay, but to my relief he was not there. I had purposely kept my knowledge of Lola's movements a secret from him, as I desired as far as possible to conduct affairs without his crazy intervention. I was not sorry, too, that he had not availed himself of my proposal to visit me that morning and continue our conversation of the night before. The grotesque, as a decoration of life, is valuable. As the main feature, it gets on your nerves. I stood on the sloping stone jetty among the crowd of Arab reporters and Europeans, and watched the vessel waddle in. Lola and I, catching sight of each other at the same time, waved handkerchiefs in an imbecile manner, and when the vessel came alongside, and during the tedious process of mooring, we regarded each other with photographic smiles. She was wearing a squirrel coat and a toque of the same fur, and she looked more like a splendid wild animal than ever. Something inside me, not the little pain, but what must have been my heart, throbbed suddenly at her beauty, and the throb was followed by a sudden sense of shock at the realization of my keen pleasure at the sight of her. A wistful radiance shone in her face as she came down the gangway. "Oh, my kind, how good, how splendid of you to meet me!" she cried as our hands clasped. "I was dreading that it might be someone else." "And yet you came straight through," said I, still holding her hand, or rather allowing hers to ensign in the familiar grip. "Didn't you command me to do so?" I could not explain matters to her then and there, among the hustle of passengers and the bustle of porters. Besides, Rogers, who had come down with the hotel omnibus, was at my side, touching his hat. "I have ordered you a room and a private sitting balcony facing the sea. Put yourself in charge of me and your luggage in charge of Rogers, and dismiss all thoughts of worry from your mind." "You are so restful," she laughed as we moved off. Then she scanned my face and said falteringly, "How thin and worn you look. Are you worse?" "If you ask me such a question," said I, "I'll leave you with the luggage in charge of Rogers. I am in resplendent health." She murmured that she wished she could believe me, and took my arm as we walked down the jetty to the waiting cab. "It's good to hear your voice again," I said. "It's a lazy voice and fits in with the lazy South." I pointed to the burnoose-enveloped Arab sleeping on the parapet. "It's out of place in Cadogan Gardens." She laughed, her low, rippling laugh. It was music very pleasant to hear after the somewhat shrill cachinnation of the Mrs. Bostock of South Shields. I was so pleased that I gave half a franc to a pestilential Arab shoeblack. "That was nice of you," she said. "It was the act of an imbecile," I retorted. "I have now rendered it impossible for me to enter the town again." "How is Dale?" She started. "He's well. Busy with his election. I saw him the day before I left. I didn't tell him I was coming to Algiers. I wrote from Paris." "Telling him the reason?" She faced me and met my eyes and said shortly, "No." "Oh," said I. This brought us to the cab. We entered and drove away. Then, leaning back and looking straight in front of her, she grasped my wrist and said, "Now, my dear friend, tell me all, and get it over." "My dear Madam Brandt," I began. She interrupted me. "For goodness' sake, don't call me that. It makes a cold shiver run down my back. I'm either Lola to you or nothing." "Then, my dear Lola," said I, "the first thing I must tell you is that I did not send for you." "What do you mean? The telegram?" "It was sent by Anastasius Papadopoulos." "Anastasius?" She bent forward and looked at me. "What is he doing here?" "Heaven knows," said I, "but what he has done has been to find Captain Vauvenard. I am glad he has done that, but I am deeply sorry he sent you the telegram." "Sorry? Why?" "Because there was no reason for your coming," I said with unwonted gravity. "It would have been better if you had stayed in London, and it will be best if you take the boat back again tomorrow." She remained silent for a while. Then she said in a low voice, "He won't have me?" "He hasn't been asked," I said. "He will, as far as I could command the situation, never be asked." On that I had fully determined, and when she inquired the reason, I told her. "I propose that you should reunite yourself with an honourable, though somewhat misguided, gentleman. I've had the reverse of pleasure in meeting Captain Vauvenard, and I regret to say, though he is still misguided, he can scarcely be termed honourable. The term gentleman has still to be accurately defined." She made a writhing movement of impatience. "Tell me straight out what he's doing in Algiers. You're trying to make things easier for me. It's the way of your class. It isn't the way of mine. I'm used to brutality. I like it better. Why did he leave the army, and why is he in Algiers?" "If you prefer the direct method, my dear Lola," said I, and the name came quite trippingly on my tongue, "I'll employ it. Your husband has apparently been kicked out of the army, and is now running a gambling hell." She took the blow bravely, but it turned her face haggard like a paroxysm of physical pain. After a few moments' silence, she said, "It must have been awful for him. He was a proud man." "He is changed," I replied gently. "Pride is too hampering a quality for a knight of industry to keep in his equipment." "Tell me how you met him," she said. I rapidly sketched the whole absurd history, from my encounter with Anastasius Papadopoulos in Marseille to my parting with him on the previous night. I softened down as much as I could the fleshiness of Captain Vauvenard and the rolls of fat at the back of his neck, but I portrayed the villainous physiognomies of his associates very neatly. I concluded by repeating my assertion that our project had proved itself to be abortive. "He must be pretty miserable," said Lola. "Devil a bit," said I. She did not answer, but settled herself more comfortably in the carriage and relapsed into mournful silence. I, having said my say, lit a cigarette. Save for the clanging past of an upward or downward tram, the creeping drive up the hill through the long winding streets was very quiet, and as we mounted higher and left the shops behind, the only sounds that broke the afternoon stillness were the driver's raucous admonition to his horses, and the wind in the trees by the wayside. At different points the turns of the road brought to view the panorama of the town below, and the calm sweep of the bay. "Exquisite, isn't it?" I said at last, with an indicative wave of the hand. "What's the good of anything being exquisite when you feel mouldy?" "It may help to charm away the mouldiness. Beauty is eternal and mouldiness only temporal. The sun will go on shining and the sea will go on changing colour long after our pains and joys have vanished from the world. Nature is pitilessly indifferent to human emotion." "If so," she said, her intuition finding the weakness of my slipshod argument, "how can it touch human mouldiness?" "I don't know," said I. "The poets will tell you. All you have to do is to lie on the breast of the Great Mother, and your heartache will go from you. I never tried it myself, as I've never been afflicted with heartache." "Is that true?" she asked, woman-like, catching at the personal. I smiled and nodded. "I'm glad on your account," she said sincerely. "It's the very devil of an ache. I've always had it." "Poor Lola," said I, prompted by my acquired instinct of humority. "I wish I could cure you." "You?" She gave a short little laugh and then turned her head away. "I had a very comfortable crossing," she remarked a moment later. I gave her into the keeping of the manager of the hotel, and did not see her again until she came down somewhat late for dinner. I met her in the vestibule. She wore a closely fitting brown dress, which in colour matched the bronze of her hair, and in shape showed off her lithe and generous figure. I thought it my duty to cheer her by a well-deserved compliment. "Are you aware," I said with a low bow, "that you're a remarkably handsome woman?" A perfectly unnecessary light came into her eyes, and a superfluous flush to her cheeks. "If I'm at least that to you, I'm happy," she said. "You are that to the dullest vision. Follow the maître d'hôtel," said I, as we entered the salle à manger, "and I'll walk behind in reflected glory." We made an effective entrance. I declare there was a perceptible rattle of soup spoons laid down by the retired colonels and maiden ladies as we passed by. Colonel Bunyan returned my nod of greeting in the most distracted fashion, and gazed at Lola with the frank admiration of British cavalry. I felt foolishly proud and exhilarated, and gave her at my table the seat commanding a view of the room. I then ordered a bottle of champagne, which I am forbidden to touch. "It isn't often that I have the pleasure of dining with you," I said by way of apology. "This is the very first time," she said. "And it's not going to be the last," I declared. "I thought you were going to ship me back to Marseille tomorrow." She laughed lazily, meeting my eyes. I smiled. "It would be inhuman. I allow you a few days' rest." Indeed, now she was here, I had a curious desire to keep her. I regarded the failure of my humorous little plans with more than satisfaction. I had done my best. I had found, through the dwarf's agency, Captain Vauvenard. I had satisfied myself that he was an outrageous person, thoroughly disqualified from becoming Lola's husband, and there was an end of the matter. Meanwhile, fate, again through the agency of Anastasius, had brought her many hundreds of miles away from Dale, and had, moreover, brought her to me. I was delighted. I patted Destiny on the back and drank his health in excellent Pommery. Lola did not know in the least what I meant, but she smiled amiably and drank the toast. It was quite a merry dinner. Lola threw herself into my mood and jested as if she had never heard of an undesirable husband who had been kicked out of the French army. We talked of many things. I described in fuller detail my adventure with Anastasius and Sopiquet, and we laughed over the debt of 15 sous and their elaborate receipt. "Anastasius," she said, "is childish in many ways. The doctors have a name for it." "Arrested development," "Ah, that's it. But he's absolutely cracked on one point, the poisoning of my horse Sultan. He hath reams of paper which he calls the dossier of the crime. You never saw such a collection of rubbish in your life. I cried over it. And he is so proud of it, poor wee mite." She laughed suddenly. "I should love to have seen you hobnobbing with him and Sir Piquet." "Why?" "You're so aristocratic-looking." She did me the embarrassing honour to explain in her direct fashion. "You're my idea of an English duke." "My dear Lola," I replied, "you're quite wrong. The ordinary English duke is a stout, middle-aged gentleman with a beard, and he generally wears thick knickerbockers and shocking bad hats." "Do you know any?" "2 or 3, I admitted." "And duchesses too?" I again pleaded guilty. In these democratic days, if one is engaged in public and social affairs, one can't help running up against them. It's their fault, not mine. "Do tell me about them," said Lola, with her elbows on the table. I told her. "And are earls and countesses just the same?" she asked, with a disappointed air. "Oh, just the same, only worse. They're so ordinary you can't pick them out from common Misters and Missuses." Saying this, I rose, for we had finished our dessert, and proposed coffee in the lounge. There we found Colonel Bunyan at so wilful a loose end that I could not find it in my heart to refuse him an introduction to Lola. He manifested his delight by lifting the skirt of his dinner jacket with his hands and rising on his spurs like a bantam cock. I left her to him for a moment, and went over to say a civil word to the Misses Bostock of South Shields. I regret to say I noticed a certain frigidity in their demeanour. The well-conducted man in South Shields does not go out one night with a revolver tucked away in the pocket of his dress suit, and turn up the next evening with a striking-looking lady with bronze hair. Such goings-on are seen on the stage in South Shields in melodrama, and they are the goings-on of the villain. In the eyes of the gentle ladies my reputation was gone. I was trying to rehabilitate myself when the chasseur brought me a telegram. I asked permission to open it and stepped outside. The words of the telegram were like a ringing box on the ears. "Tell me immediately why Lola has joined you in Algiers. Kinnersley." Not Dale, mark you, as he had signed himself ever since I knew him in Eton collars, but Kinnersley. "Why has Lola joined you? Why have you run off with Lola? What's the reason of this treacherous abduction? Account for yourself immediately. Stand and deliver." I stood there gaping at the words like an idiot, my blood tingling at the implied accusation. The peremptoriness of it, the impudence of the boy, the wild extravagance of the idea. And yet, while my head was reeling with one buffet, a memory arose and gave me another on the other side. I remembered the preposterous attitude in which Dale had found us when he rushed from Berlin into Lola's drawing-room. I took the confounded telegram into a remote corner of the lounge, like a dog with a bone, and growled over it for a time, until the humour of the situation turned the growl into a chuckle. Even had I been in sound health and strength, the idea of running off with Lola would have been absurd. But for me, in my present humorous disposition of mind, for me, a half-disembodied spirit who had cast all vain and disturbing human emotions into the mud of Murglebed-on-Sea, for me who had a spirit's calm disregard for the petty passions and interests of mankind, and walked through the world with no other object than healing a few human woes, for me, who already saw death on the other side of the river, and found serious occupation in exchanging airy badinage with him, for me, with an abominable little pain inside, inexorably eating my life out and wasting me away, literally and perceptibly like a shadow, and twisting me up 6 times a day in excruciating agony, for me, in this delectable condition of soul and this deplorable condition of body, to think of running hundreds of miles from home with, to say the least of it, so inconvenient a creature as a big bronzed-haired woman. The idea was inexpressibly and weirdly comic. I stepped into the drawing-room close by, and drew up a telegram to Dale. "Lady summoned by Papadopoulos on private affairs. Avoid lunacy save for electioneering purposes. Simon." Then I joined Lola and Colonel Bunyan. She was lying back in her laziest and most pantherine attitude, and she looked up at me as I approached with eyes full of velvet softness. For the life of me I could not help feeling glad that they were turned on me, and not on Dale Kinnersley. Almost immediately the elder Miss Bostock came up to claim the Colonel for bridge. He rose reluctantly. "I suppose it's no use asking you to make a fourth, Mr. de Gex?" she asked, after the sub-acid manner of her kind. "I'm afraid not," I replied sweetly. Whereupon she rescued the Colonel from the siren and left me alone with her. I lit a cigarette and sat by her side. As she did not stir or speak, I asked whether she was tired. "Not very. I'm thinking. Do you know you've taught me an awful lot?" "I? What can I have taught you?" "The way people like yourself look at things. I'm treating Dale abominably. I didn't realise it before." Now why on earth did she bring Dale in just at that moment? "Indeed," said I. She nodded her head and said in her languorous voice, "He's over head and ears in love with me and thinks I care for him. I don't. I don't care a brass button for him. I'm a bad influence in his life, and the sooner I take myself out of it the better. Don't you think so?" "You know my opinions," I said. "If I had followed your advice at first," she continued, "we needn't have had all this commotion, and yet I'm not sorry." "What do you propose to do?" I asked. "Before deciding, I shall see my husband." "You shall do no such thing." She smiled. "I shall?" I protested. Captain Vauvenard had put himself outside the pale. He was not fit to associate with decent women. What object could she have in meeting him? "I want to judge for myself," she replied. "Judge what? Surely not whether he is eligible as a husband." "Yes," she said. "But, my dear Lola," I cried, "the notion is as crazy as any of Anastasius Papadopoulos's. Of course, as soon as he learns that you're a rich woman, he'll want to live with you and use your money for his gaming hell." "I am going to meet him," she said quietly. "I forbid it." "You're too late, dear friend. I wrote him a letter before dinner and sent it to the Cercle Africain by special messenger. I also wrote to Anastasius. I asked them both to see me tomorrow morning. That's why I've been so gay this evening." At the sight of my blank face she laughed, and with one of her movements rose from her chair. I rose too. "Are you angry with me?" "I thought I had walked out of a nightmare," I said. "I find I'm still in it." "But don't be angry with me. It was the only way." "The only way to or out of what?" I asked, bewildered. "Never mind." She looked at me with a singular expression in her slumbrous eyes. It was sad, wistful, soothing, and gave me the idea of a noble woman making a senseless sacrifice. "There's no earthly reason to do this on account of Dale," I protested. "Dale has nothing to do with it." "Then who has?" "Anastasius Papadopoulos," she said with undisguised irony. "I beg your pardon," I said rather stiffly, "for appearing to force your confidence. But as I first put the idea of joining your husband into your head, and have enjoyed your confidence in the matter hitherto, I thought I might claim certain privileges." As she had done before, she laid her hands on my shoulders — we were alone in the alcove — and looked me in the eyes. "Don't make me cry. I'm very near it, and I'm tired tonight, and I'm going to have a hellish time tomorrow, and I want you to do me a favour." "What is that?" "When I'm seeking my husband, I'd like to know that you were within call in case I wanted you. One never knows what might happen. You will come, won't you, if I send for you?" "I'm always at your service," I said. She released my shoulders and grasped my hand. "Good night," she said abruptly, and rushed swiftly out of the room, leaving me wondering more than I had ever wondered in my life at the inscrutable ways of women. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 14. I am glad I devoted last night and the past hour this morning to bringing up to date this trivial record, for I have a premonition that the time is rapidly approaching when I shall no longer have the strength of will or body to continue it. The little pain has increased in intensity and frequency the last few days, and though I try to delude myself into the belief that otherwise I am as strong as ever, I know in my heart that I am daily growing weaker, daily losing vitality. I shall soon have to call in a doctor to give me some temporary relief, and doubtless he will put me to bed, feed me on slops, cut off alcohol, forbid noise and excitement, and keep me in a drugged, stupefied condition until I fall asleep to wake up in the garden of Proserpine. Death is nothing. It is the dying that is such a nuisance. It is going through so much for so little. It is as bad as the campaign before a parliamentary election. It offends one's sense of proportion. In a well-regulated universe there would be no tedious process of decay, either before or after death. You would go about your daily avocation unconcerned and unwarned, and then, at the moment appointed by an inscrutable providence for your dissolution, phew! And your clothes would remain standing for a surprise second, and then fall down in a heap, without a particle of you inside them. If we have to die, why doesn't Providence employ this simple and sensible method? It would save such a lot of trouble. It would be so clean, so painless, so picturesque. It would add to the interest of our walks abroad. Fancy a stout, important policeman vanishing from his uniform, the helmet falling over the collar, the tunic doubling in at the belt, the knees giving way, and the unheard, merry laughter, his uniformed spirit winging its way truncheonless into the Empyrean. But if you think you're going to get any fun out of dying in the present inconvenient manner, you are mistaken. Believe one who is trying. I will remain on my feet, however, as long as my will holds out. In this way I may continue to be of service to my fellow creatures, and procure for myself a happy lot or portion. Even this morning I have been able to free the throb of humority. A pietous letter from Latimer, and a substantial cheque lies on my table, ready to be posted. I wonder how much I have left. So long as it is enough to pay my doctor's bills and funeral expenses, what does it matter? The last line of the above was written on December the 21st. It is now January the 30th, and I am still alive and able to write. I wish I weren't. But I will set down as plainly as I can what has happened in the interval. I had just written the last word, seated at my hotel window in the sunshine, and enjoying, in spite of my uncheerful thoughts, the scents that rose from the garden, when I heard a knock at my door. At my invitation to enter, Anastasius Papadopoulos trotted into the room in a great state of excitement, carrying the familiar bunch of papers. He put his hat on the floor, pitched his papers into the hat, and ran up to me. "My dear sir, don't get up, I implore you, and I won't sit down. I have just seen the ever-beautiful and beloved lady." I turned my chair away from the table and faced him as he stood blowing kisses with one little hand, while the other lay on his heart. In a flash he struck a new gesture. He folded his arms and scowled. "I was with her. She was opening her inmost heart to me. She knows I am her champion. A servant came up announcing Monsieur Vavinard. She dismissed me. I have come to my patron and friend, the English statesman. Her husband is with her now." I smiled. Madame Brandt told me that she had asked for an interview. "And you allow it? You allow her to contaminate her beautiful presence with the sight of that traitor, that cheat at cards, that murderer, that devil? Ah, but I will not have it. I am her champion. I will save her. I will save you. I will take you both away to Egypt and surround you with my beautiful cats and fan you with peacock's feathers." This was sheer crackedness of brain. For the first time I feared for the little man. When people begin to talk that way, they are not allowed to go about loose. He went on talking, and the 3 languages he used in his jargon got clotted to the point of unintelligibility. He spoke very fast, and as far as I could understand, poured abuse on the head of Captain Vauvenard, and continued to declare himself Lola's champion and my devoted friend. He stamped up and down the room in his tightly buttoned frock coat, from the breast pocket of which peeped the fingers of his yellow dogskin gloves. At last he stopped, and drawing a chair near the window, perched on it with a little hop like a child. He held out his hand. "Do you believe I am your friend?" "I am sure of it, my dear Professor." "Then I betray a secret confidence. The Carissima Signora loves you. You didn't know it, but she loves you." I stared for a moment at the dwarf, as if he had been a reasonable being. Something seemed to click inside my head, like a clogged cogwheel that has suddenly freed itself, and my mind went whirling away straight through the past few weeks. I tried to smile, and I said, "You are quite mistaken." "Oh, no," he replied, wagging his Napoleonic head. "Anastasia Papadopoulos is never mistaken. She told me so herself. She wept. She put her beautiful arms round my neck and sobbed on my shoulder." I found myself reproving him gently. "You should not have told me this, my dear Professor. Such confidences are locked up in the heart of un galant homme, and are not revealed even to his dearest friend." But my voice sounded hollow in my own ears, and what he said for the next few minutes I do not remember. The little man had told the truth to me, and Lola had told the truth to him. The realization of it paralysed me. Why had I been such a fool as not to see it for myself? Memories of 100 indications came tumbling one after another into my head. The forgotten love, the glances, the changes of mood, the tears when she learned of my illness, the mysterious words, the abrupt little "you" of yesterday. The woman was in love, deeply in love with all the fervour of her big nature. And I had stood by and wondered what she meant by this and by that, things that would have been obvious to a coal-heaver. I thought of Dale, and I felt miserably guilty, horribly ashamed. How could I expect him to believe me when I told him that I had not wittingly stolen her affections from him? And her affections? Bon Dieu! What on earth could I do with them? What is the use of a woman's love to a dead man? And did I want it even for the tiny remainder of life? Anastasius, perceiving that I paid but scant attention to his conversation, wriggled off his chair and stood before me with folded arms. "You adore each other with a great passion," he said. "She is my Madonna, and you are my friend and benefactor. I will be your protection and defence. I will never let her go away with that infamous gambling and murdering scoundrel. My gigantic combinations have matured. I bless your union." He lifted his little arms in benediction. The situation was cruelly comical. For a moment I hated the mournful-visaged, posturing monkey, and had a wild desire to throw him out of the window and have done with him. I rose, and, towering over him, was about to lecture him severely on his impertinent interference, when the sight of his scared face made me turn away with a laugh. What would be the use of reproaching him? He would only sit down on the floor and weep. So I paced the room, while he followed me with his eyes like an uncertain spaniel. "Look here, Professor," said I at last. "Now that you've found Captain Vauvenard, brought Madame Brandt and him together, and told me that she is in love with me, don't you think you've done enough? Don't you think your cats need your attention? Something terrible may be happening to them. I dreamed last night," I added with desperate mendacity, "that they were turned into woolly lambs." "Monsieur," said the dwarf loftily, "my duty is here, and I care not whether my cats are turned into the angels of paradise." I groaned. "You are wasting a great deal of money over this affair," I urged. "What is money to my gigantic combinations?" "Tell me," I cried with considerable impatience, "what are your confounded combinations?" He began to tremble violently. "I would rather die," said he, "than betray my secret." "It's all some silly nonsense about that wretched horse," I exclaimed. He covered his ears with his hands. "Blasphemy! Blasphemy! Don't utter it!" In another moment he was cowering on his knees before me. "You, of all men, mustn't blaspheme. You whom I love like my master. You whom the divine lady loves. I can't bear it." He continued to gibber unintelligibly. He was stark mad. There was no question of it. For a moment I stood irresolute. Then I lifted him to his feet and patted his head soothingly. "Never mind," said I. "I was wrong. It was such a beautiful horse. There never was such a horse in the world. If I had a picture of him, I would hang it up on the wall over my bed." "Would you?" he cried joyfully. "Then I will give you one." He trotted over to the bundle of papers that reposed in his hat on the floor, searched through them, and to my dismay handed me a faded, unmounted, and rather torn and crumpled photograph of the wonderful horse. "There," said he. "I could not rob you of it," I protested. "It will be my joy to know you have it, that it is hanging over your bed. See, have you a pin? I myself will fetch it for you." While he was searching my table for pins, The chasseur of the hotel came with a message from Madame Brandt. Would Monsieur come at once to Madame in her private room? "I'll come now," I said. "Professor, you must excuse me." "Don't mention it. I shall occupy myself in hanging in the most artistic way possible." So I left him, his mind apparently concentrated on the childish task of pinning the photographs of the ridiculous horse on my bedroom wall, and went with the most complicated feelings downstairs and through the corridors to Lola's apartments. She rose to meet me as I entered. "It's very kind of you to come," she said in her fluent but Britannic French. "Present my husband, Monsieur Vauvenard." Monsieur Vauvenard and I exchanged bows. I noticed at once that he wore the Frenchman's costume when he pays a visite de cérémonie, frock-coat and gloves, and that a silk hat lay on the table. I was glad that he paid her this mark of respect. "I have had the pleasure of meeting you before, monsieur," said he, "in circumstances somewhat different." "I remember perfectly," said I. "And your charming but inexperienced friend, is he well?" "He is at present decorating my room with photographs of Madame's late horse, Sultan," said I. He was startled and gave me a quick, sharp look. I did not notice it at the time, but I remembered it later. Then he broke into an indulgent laugh. "The poor animal!" He turned to Lola. "How jealous I used to be of him, and how quickly the time flies! But give yourself the trouble of seating yourself, monsieur." He motioned me to a chair and sat down. He was a man of polished manner and had a pleasant voice. I guessed that in the days when he paid court to Lola, he had been handsome in his dark Norman way and possessed considerable fascination. Evil living and sordid passions had coarsened his features, produced bagginess under the eyes and a shiftiness of glance. Idleness and an inverted habit of life were responsible for the nascent paunch and the rolls of fat at the back of his neck. He suggested the revivified corpse of a fine gentleman that had been unnaturally swollen. I had disliked him at the Cercle Africain. Now I detested him heartily. The idea of Lola entering the weighted atmosphere of his life was inexpressibly repugnant to me. Contrary to her habit, Lola sat bolt upright on the stamped velvet suite, the palms of her hands pressing the seat on either side of her. She caught the shade of disgust that swept over my face, and gave me a quick glance and pleaded for toleration. Her eyes, though bright, were sunken, like those of a woman who has not slept. "Monsieur," said Vauvenard, "my wife informs me that to your disinterested friendship is due this most charming reconciliation." "Reconciliation?" I echoed. "It was quickly effected." "Mon Dieu," he said, "I have always longed for the comforts of a home. My wife has grown tired of a migratory existence. She comes to find me. I hastened to meet her. There is nothing to keep us apart. The reconciliation was a matter of a few seconds. I wish to express my gratitude to you, and therefore I ask you to accept my most cordial thanks." "It has always been a pleasure to me," said I very frigidly, "to place my services at the disposal of Madame Brandt." "Vauvenard, monsieur," he corrected with a smile. "And is Madame Vauvenard equally satisfied with the reconciliation?" I asked. "I think Monsieur Vauvenard is somewhat premature," said Lola with a trembling lip. "There were conditions." "A mere question of protocol." He waved an airy hand. "I don't know what that is," said Lola. "There are conditions I must fix, and I thought the advice of my friend Monsieur de Gex—" "Precisely, my dear Lola," he interrupted. "The principle is affirmed. We are reconciled. I proceed logically. The first thing I do is to thank Monsieur de Gex. You have a French name, monsieur, and you pronounce it English fashion, which is somewhat embarrassing, but no matter. The next thing is the protocol. We have no possibility of calling a family council, and therefore I acceded with pleasure to the intervention of monsieur. It is kind of him to burden himself with our unimportant affairs." The irony of his tone belied the suave correctitude of his words. I detested him more and more. More and more did I realize that the dying humorist is capable of petty human passions. My vanity was being sacrificed. Here was a woman passionately in love with me, proposing to throw herself into another man's arms. It made not a scrap of difference in the circumstances that the man was her husband. And into the arms of such a man! Having known me to decline, etc., etc., how could she face it, and why was she doing it? To save herself from me, or me from herself? She knew perfectly well that the little pain inside would precious soon settle that question. Why was she doing it? I should have thought that the first glance at the puffy reprobate would have been enough to show her the folly of her idea. However, it was comforting to learn that she had not surrendered at once. "If I am to have the privilege, monsieur," said I, "of acting as a family counsel, perhaps you may forgive my hinting at some of the conditions that doubtless are in Madame's mind." "Proceed, monsieur," said he. "I wanted to know where I am," said Lola in English. "He took everything for granted from the first." "Are you willing to go back to him?" I asked, also in English. She met my gaze steadily, and I saw a woman's needless pain at the back of her eyes. She moistened her lips with her tongue and said, "Under conditions?" "Monsieur," said I in French, turning to Vauvenard, "forgive us for speaking our language." "Perfectly," said he, and he smiled meaningly and banteringly at us both. "In the first place, monsieur, you are aware that Madame has a little fortune which does not detract from the charm you have always found in her. It was left to her by her father, who, as you know, tamed lions and directed a menagerie. I would propose that Madame appointed trustees to administer this little fortune." "There is no necessity, monsieur," he said. "By the law of France it is hers to do what she likes with." "Precisely," I rejoined. "Trustees would prevent her from doing what she liked with it. Madame has indeed a head for affairs, but she also has a woman's heart, which sometimes interferes with a woman's head in the most disastrous manner." "Article number 1 of the protocol. Allez toujours, monsieur." I went on, feeling happier. "The next article treats of a little matter which I understand has been the cause of differences in the past between Madame and yourself. Madame, although she has not entered the arena for some time, has not finally abandoned it." I smiled at the look of surprise on Lola's face. "An artist is always an artist, monsieur. She is willing, however, to renounce it for ever, if you, on your side, will make quite a small sacrifice." "Name it, monsieur." "You have a little passion for baccarat." "Surely, monsieur," said he blandly, "my wife would not expect me to give up what is the mere recreation of every clubman." "As a recreation pure and simple, she would not insist too much, but—" I shrugged my shoulders. I flattered myself on being able to do it with perfect French expressiveness. I caught, to my satisfaction, an angry gleam in his eye. "Do you mean to say, monsieur, that I play for more than récréation?" "How dare I say anything, monsieur? But Madame is prejudiced against the Cercle Africain. For a bachelor there is little to be said against it, but for a married man—" "You seize the point?" said I. "Bien, monsieur," he said, swallowing his wrath. "And Article 3? Since you have left the army, would it not be better to engage in some profession, unless your private fortune dispenses you from the necessity?" He said nothing but, "Article 4? It would give Madame comfort to live out of Algiers." "Moi aussi," he replied rather unexpectedly. "We have the whole of France to choose from." "Would not Madame be happier if she lived out of France also? She has always longed for a social position." "Eh bien, I can give her one in France." "Are you quite sure?" I asked, looking him in the eye. "Monsieur," said he, rising and giving his moustache a swashbuckler twist upward, "what are you daring to insinuate?" I leaned back in my chair and fingered the waxed ends of mine. "Nothing, monsieur. I ask a simple question, which you surely can have no difficulty in answering." "Your questions are the height of indiscretion," he cried angrily. "In that case, before we carry this interview further, the family council and Madame would do well to have a private consultation." "Monsieur," he cried, completely losing his temper, "I forbid you to use that tone to me. You are making a mock of me. You are insulting me. I bore with you long enough to see how much further your insolence would dare to go. I'm not to have a hand in the administration of my wife's money. I'm to forsake a plentiful means of livelihood. I'm to become a commercial traveller. I'm to expatriate myself. I'm to explain, too, the reasons why I left the army. I would not condescend, least of all to you." "May I ask why, monsieur?" "Tonnerre de Dieu!" He stamped his foot. "Do you take me for a fool? Here I am. I came at my wife's request, ready to take her back as my wife, ready to condone everything. Yes, monsieur, as a man of the world. You think I have no eyes, no understanding. Ready to take her off your hands." I leaped to my feet. "Monsieur!" I thundered. Lola gave a cry and rushed forward. I pushed her aside and glared at him. I was in a furious rage. We glared at each other, eye to eye. I pointed to the door. "Monsieur, sortez!" I went to it and flung it wide. Anastasius Papadopoulos trotted into the room. His entrance was so queer, so unexpected, so anticlimactic, that for the moment the three of us were thrown off our emotional balance. "I have heard all, I have heard all!" shrieked the little man. "I know you for what you are. I am the champion of the Carissima Signora and the protector of the English statesman. You are a traitor and murderer." Bernard lifted his hand in a threatening gesture. "Hold your tongue, you little abortion!" he shouted. But Anastasius went on screaming and flourishing his bundle of papers. "Ask him if he remembers the horse Sultan! Ask him if he remembers the horse Sultan!" Lola took him by the shoulders. "Anastasius, you must go away from here, to please me. It's my orders." But he shook himself free, and the silk hat which he had not removed fell off in the quick struggle. "Ask him if he remembers Sopiquet!" he screamed, and then banged the door. The malevolent devil put a sudden idea into my head and prompted speech. "Do you remember Sopiquet?" I asked, ironically. "Monsieur, meddle with your own affairs and let me pass. You shall hear from me." The dwarf planted himself before the door. "You shall not pass till you have answered me. Do you remember Sopiquet? Do you remember the 5 francs you gave to Sopiquet to let you into Sultan's stable? Ha, 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 ha! You wince, you grow pale. Do you remember the ball of poison you put down Sultan's throat?" Lola started forward with flaming eyes and anguished face. You, she gasped. "You were so ignoble as to do that?" "The accursed brute!" shouted Vauvenard. "Yes, I did it. I wish I had burned out his entrails." Anastasia sprang at him like a tiger cat. I had a quick vision of the dwarf clinging in the air against the other's bulky form, one hand at his throat, and then of an incredibly swift flash of steel. The dwarf dropped off and rolled backwards, revealing something black sticking out of Vauvenard's frock-coat. For a second I could not realize what it was. Then Vauvenard, with a ghastly face, reeled sideways and collapsed in a heap on the ground. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Simon the Jester by William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 15. Of what happened immediately afterwards I have but a confused memory. I remember that Lola and I both fell on our knees beside the stabbed man, and I remember his horrible staring eyes and open mouth. I remember that, though she was white and shaky, she neither shrieked, went into hysterics, nor fainted. I remember rushing down to the manager. I remember running with him breathlessly through obscure passages of the hotel in search of a doctor who was attending a sick member of the staff. I remember the rush back, the doctor bending over the body which Lola had partly unclothed, and saying, "He is dead. The blade has gone straight through his heart." And I have in my mind the unforgettable and awful picture of Anastasius Papadopoulos disregarded in a corner of the room with his absurd silk hat on. Some reflex impulse had caused him to pick it up and put it on his head, sitting on the floor amid a welter of documents relating to the death of the horse Sultan, one of which he was eagerly perusing. After this my memory is clear. It was only the first awful shock and horror of the thing that dazed me. The man was dead, said the doctor. He must lie until the police arrived and drew up the procès-verbal. The manager went to telephone to the police, and while he was gone I told the doctor what had occurred. Anastasius took no notice of us. Lola, holding her nerves under iron control, stood bolt upright, looking alternately at the doctor and myself as we spoke. but she did not utter a word. Presently the manager returned. The alarm had not been given in the hotel. No one knew anything about the occurrence. Lola went into her bedroom and came back with a sheet. The manager took it from her and threw it over the dead man. The doctor stood by Anastasius. The end of a strip of sunlight by the window just caught the dwarf in his corner. "Get up," said the doctor. Anastasius, without raising his eyes from his papers, waved him away. "I am busy. I am engaged on important papers of identification. He had a white star on his forehead and his tail was over 1 metre long." Lola approached him. "Anastasius," she said gently. He looked up with a radiant smile. "Put away those papers." Like a child he obeyed and scrambled to his feet. Then, seeing the unfamiliar face of the doctor for the first time, he executed one of his politest and most elaborate bows. The doctor, after looking at him intently for a while, turned to me. "Mad, utterly mad. Apparently he has no consciousness of what he has done." He lured him to the sofa and sat beside him and began to talk in a low tone of the contents of the papers. Anastasius replied cheerfully, proud of being noticed by the stranger. The papers referred to a precious secret, a gigantic combination which he had spent years in maturing. I shivered at the sound of his voice and turned to Lola. "This is no place for you. Go into your bedroom till you are wanted." I held the door open for her. She put her hands up to her face and reeled, and I thought she would have fallen, but she roused herself. "I don't want to break down, not yet. I shall if I'm left alone. Come and sit with me, for God's sake." "Very well," said I. She passed me, and I followed, but at the door I turned and glanced round the cheerful, sunny room. There, against the background of blue sky and tree-tops framed by the window, sat Anastasius Papadopoulos, swinging his little legs and talking bombastically to the tanned and grizzled doctor. And opposite stood the correctly attired hotel manager, in the attitude in which he habitually surveyed the layout table d'hôte, keeping watch beside the white-covered shape on the floor. I was glad to shut the sight from my eyes. We waited silently in the bedroom, Lola sitting on the bed and hiding her face in the pillows, and I standing by the window and looking out at the smiling mockery of the fair earth. An agonizing spasm of pain, a memento mori, shot through me and passed away. I thanked God that a few weeks would see the end of me. I had always enjoyed the comedy of life. It had been to me a thing of infinite jest. But this stupid, meaningless tragedy was carrying the joke too far. My fastidiousness revolted at its vulgarity. I no longer wished to inhabit a world where such jests were possible. I had never seen a man die before. I was surprised at the swiftness and the ugliness of it. I suddenly realized that I was smoking a cigarette which I was quite unconscious of having lit. I threw it away. A minute afterwards I felt that if I did not smoke I should go crazy, so I lit another. The ghastly silliness of the murder. Colonel Bunyan's loud laugh rose from the terrace below, jarring horribly on my ears. A long green praying mantis that had apparently mounted on the bougainvillea against the hotel wall appeared in meditative stateliness on the window-sill. I picked the insect up absent-mindedly and began to play with it. Lola's voice from the bed startled me and caused me to drop the mantis. She spoke hoarsely. "Tell me, what are they going to do with him?" I turned round. She had raised a crushed face from the pillows and looked at me haggardly. I noticed a carafe of brandy and a siphon by the bedside. I mixed her a strong dose, and before replying made her drink it. "They'll place him under restraint, that's all. He's not responsible for his actions." "He did that once before, I told you, but without the knife. I wish I could cry. I can't. You don't think it heartless of me, but my brain is on fire. I shall always see it. I wish to God I'd never asked him to come. Why did I? My God, why did I? It was my fault. I wanted to see him, to judge for myself how much of the old André was left. There was good in him once. I thought I might possibly help him. There was nothing for me to do in the world. Without you, any kind of old hell was good enough. That's why I sent for him. When he came after a bit, I was afraid and sent for you." "Afraid of what?" I asked. "He asked me at once what money I had.
Then there seemed to be no doubt in his mind that I would join him. We spoke of you, the friend who could advise me. He never said what he said afterwards. I thought it kind of him to consent to see you. I rang the bell and sent the chasseur for you. I supposed Anastasius has gone home. I never thought of him. The poor little man was sweet to me, just like a dog, a silent, sympathetic dog. I spoke to him as I would to something that wouldn't understand, all sorts of foolish things. Now and then a woman has to empty her heart. She shivered, her hands before her face. It's my fault. It's my fault. These things are no one's fault, I said gently. But just as I was beginning to console her with what thumb-marked scraps of platitude I could collect, the only philosophy after all, such as the futility of systems adequate to the deep issues of life, the door opened and the manager announced that the police had arrived. We went through the ordeal of the procès verbal. Anastasius, confronted with his victim, had no memory of what had occurred. He shrieked and shrank and hid his face in Lola's dress. When he was forced to speak, he declared that the dead man was not Captain Vauvenard. Captain Vauvenard was of the Cercle Africain. He himself was seeking him. He would take the gendarmes there, and they could arrest the captain for the murder of Sultan, of which his papers contained indubitable proofs. Eventually, the poor little wretch was led away in custody, proud and smiling, entirely convinced that he was leading his captors to the arrest of Captain Vauvenard. On the threshold he turned and bowed to us so low that the brim of his silk hat touched the floor. Then Lola's nerve gave way, and she broke into a passion of awful weeping. The commissaire de police secured the long, thin knife. How the dwarf had managed to conceal it on his small person was a mystery, and the bundle of documents, and accompanied me to my room to see whether he had left anything there to serve as a pièce de conviction. We found only the crumpled picture of the horse Sultan neatly pinned against my bedroom wall, and on the floor a ribbon tied like a garter with a little bell opposite the bow. On it was written Santa Bianca, and I knew it was the collar of the beloved cat which he must have been carrying about him for a talisman. The commissaire took this also. If you desire to know the details of the judicial proceedings connected with the murder of André-Marie-Joseph Vauvenard, ex-captain in the Chasseurs d'Afrique, and the trial of Anastasius Papadopoulos, I must refer you to the Algerian, Parisian, and London press. There you will find an eagerly picturesque account of the whole miserable affair. Now, not only am I unable to compete with descriptive verbatim reporters on their own ground, but also a consecutive statement, either bald or graphic, of the tedious horrors Lola Brandt and I had to undergo, would be foreign to the purpose of these notes, however far from their original purpose an ironical destiny has caused them to wander. You know nearly all that is necessary for you to know, so that when I am dead you may not judge me too harshly. The remainder I can summarize in a few words. At any rate, I have told the truth, often more naively than one would have thought possible for a man who prided himself, as much as I did, on his Epicurean sophistication. These have been days, as I say, of tedious horror. There have been endless examinations, reconstructions of the crime, exposures in daring publicity of the private lives of the protagonists of the lunatic drama. The French judges and advocates have accepted the account given by Lola and myself of our mutual relations with a certain mocking credulity. The press hasn't accepted it at all. It took as a matter of course the view held by the none too noble victim. At first, seeing Lola shrug her shoulders with supreme indifference as to her own reputation, I cared but little for these insinuations. I wrote such letters to my sisters and to Dale as I felt sure would be believed, and let the long-eared, gaping world go hang. Besides, I had other things to think of. Physical pain is insistent, and I have suffered damnable torture. The pettiness of the legal inquiry has been also a maddening irritation. Nothing has been too minute for the attention of the French judiciary. It seemed as though the whole of the Eagle gang of the Cercle Africain were called as witnesses. They testified as to Captain Vauvenard's part proprietorship of the hell, as to wrong practices that occurred there, as to the crazy conduct of both Anastasius and myself on the occasion of my insane visit. Officers of the Chasseurs d'Afrique were compelled further to blacken the character of the dead man. He had been a notorious plucker of pigeons during most of his military career, and when at last he was caught red-handed palming the king at écarté, he was forced to resign his commission. Arabs came from the slums with appalling stories. Even the stolid Sopiquet, dragged from Toulon, gave evidence as to the 5-franc bribe and the debt of 15 sous, and identified the horse Sultan by the crumpled photograph. Lola and I had been racked day after day with questions, some, indeed, prompted by the suspicion that Vauvenard might have met his death directly by our hand instead of that of Anastasius. It was the Procureur Général who said, "It can be argued that you would benefit by the decease of the defunct." I replied that we could not benefit in any way. My sole object was to effect a reconciliation between husband and wife. "Will you explain why you gave yourself that trouble?" I never have smiled so grimly as I did then. How could I explain my precious pursuit of the humorous to a French Procureur Général? How could I put before him the point of view of a semi-disembodied spirit? I replied, with lame lack of originality, that my actions proceeded from disinterested friendship. "You are a pure altruist, then," said he. "Very pure," said I. It was only the facts of the scabbard of the knife having been found attached to the dwarf's person beneath his clothes, and of certain rambling menaces occurring in his Sultan papers, that saved us from the indignity of being arrested and put into the dock. During all this time I remained at the hotel at Mustapha Supérieur. Lola moved to a suite of rooms in another hotel a little way down the hill. I saw her daily. At first she shrank from publicity and refused to go out, save in a closed carriage, to the town, where her presence was necessary in the inquiries. But after a time I persuaded her to brave the stare of the curious and stroll with me among the eucalyptus woods above. We cut ourselves off from other human companionship and felt like two lost souls wandering alone through mist. She conducted herself with grave and simple dignity. Once or twice she visited Anastasius in prison. She found him humanely treated and not despondent. He thought they had arrested him for the poisoning of the horse, and laughed at their foolishness. As they refused to return him his dossier, he occupied himself in reconstructing it, and wrote pages and pages of incoherence to prove the guilt of Captain Vauvenard. He was hopelessly mad. The bond of pain bound me very close to Lola. "What are you going to do with your life?" I asked her one day. "So long as I have you as a friend, it doesn't greatly matter." "You forget," I said, "that you can't have me much longer." "Are you going to leave me? It's not because I have dragged you through all this dirt and horror. Another woman might say that of another man, but not I of you. Why are you going to leave me? I want so little, only to see you now and then, to keep the heart in me." "Can't you realize that what I said in London is true?" "No, I can't. It's unbelievable. You can't believe it yourself. If you did, how could you go on behaving like anybody else, like me, for instance?" "What would you do if you were condemned to die?" She shuddered. "I should go mad with fear. She broke off and remained for some moments reflective with knitted brow. Then she lifted her head proudly. "No, I shouldn't. I should face it like you. Only cowards are afraid. It's best to show things that you don't care a hang for them." "Keep that sublime je m'en fiche me up when I am dead and buried," said I, "and you'll pull through your life all right. The only thing you must avoid is the pursuit of humority." "What on earth is that?" she asked. "The last devastating vanity," said I. "And so it is." "When you are gone," she said bravely, "I shall remember how strong and true you were. It will make me strong too." I acquiesced silently in her proposition. In this age of flippancy and scepticism, if a human soul proclaims sincerely its faith in the divinity of a rabbit, in God's name don't disturb it. It is something whereto to refer his aspirations, his resolves. It is a court of arbitration, at the lowest, for his spiritual disputes, and the rabbit will be as effective an oracle as any other. For are not all religions but the strivings of the spirit towards crystallization at some point, outside the environments of passions and appetites which is the flesh, so that it can work untrammelled, And are not all gods but the accidental forms, conditioned by circumstance, which this crystallization takes? All gods in their anthropo, helio, thero, or what-not morphic forms are false. But on the other hand, all gods in their spiritual essence are true. So I do not deprecate my prospective unique possession in Lola Brandt's hagiology. It was better for her soul that I should occupy it, even if I were about to live my normal life out like any other hearty human, marry and beget children. I doubt whether I should attempt to shake my wife's faith in my heroical qualities. This was but a fragment of one among countless talks. Some were lighter in tone, others darker, the mood of man being much like a child's bloom, which rises or falls as the strata of air are more rarefied or more dense. Perhaps during the time of strain the atmosphere was more often rarefied, and our conversation had the day's depressing incidents for its topics. We rarely spoke of the dead man. He was scarcely a subject for panegyric, and it was useless to dwell on the memory of his degradation. I think we only once talked of him deeply and at any length, and that was on the day of the funeral. His brother, a manufacturer at Clermont-Ferrand, and a widowed aunt, apparently his only two surviving relatives, arrived in Algiers just in time to attend the ceremony. They had seen the report of the murder in the newspapers and had started forthwith. The brother, during an interview with Lola, said bitter things to her, reproaching her with the man's downfall, and cast on her the responsibility of his death. "He spoke," she said, "as if I had suggested the murder, and practically put the knife into the poor crazy little fellow's hand." The Vauvenards must have been an amiable family. "Before I came," she said a little while later, "I still had some tenderness for him. A woman has for the only man that has been, really, in her life. I wish I could feel it now. I wish I could feel some respect even. But I can't. If I could, it would lessen the horror that has got hold of me to my bones." It was a torture to her generous soul that she could not grieve for him. She could only shudder at the tragedy. In her heart she grieved more for Anastasius Papadopoulos, and in so doing she, in her feminine way, self-accusative of callous lack of human feeling. It was my attempt to bring her to a more rational state of mind that caused us to review the dead man's career, and recapitulate the unpleasing incidents of the last interview. Of Captain Vauvenard no more. He is gone whither I am going. That his soul may rest in peace is my earnest prayer, but I do not wish to meet him. Lola went tearless and strong through the horrible ordeal of the judicial proceedings. She said I gave her courage. Perhaps unconsciously I did. It was only when the end came that she broke down, although she knew exactly what the end would be. And I too felt a lump in my throat when they sentenced Anastasius Papadopoulos to the asylum, and I saw him for the last time, the living parody of Napoleon III, frock-coated and yellow-gloved, the precious newly written dossier in his hand, as he disappeared with a mournful smile from the court, after bowing low to the judge and to us, without having understood the significance of anything that had happened. In the carriage that took us home, she wept and sobbed bitterly. "I loved him so. He was the only creature on earth that loved me. He loved me as only a dog can love, or an angel." I let her cry. What could I say or do? These have been weeks of tedious horror and pain. With the exception of Colonel Bunyan, I have kept myself aloof from my fellow creatures in the hotel, even taking my meals in my own rooms, not wishing to be stared at as the hero of the scandal that convulsed the place. And with regard to Colonel Bunyan, shall I be accused of cynicism if I say that I admitted him, not to my confidence, but to my company, because I know that it delighted the honest but boring fellow to prove to himself that he could rise above British prejudice and exhibit tact in dealing with a man in a delicate position. For, mark you, all the world, even those nearest and dearest to me, as I soon discovered, believed that the wife of the man who was murdered before my eyes was my mistress. Colonel Bunyan was kind, and he meant to be kind. He was a gentleman for all his wearisomeness, and his kindness was such as I could accept.
But I know what I say about him is true. Ye gods, haven't I felt myself the same swelling pride in my broad-mindedness? When a man is going on a journey, he does not palter with truth. Though I held myself aloof, as I say, from practically all my fellow creatures here, I have not been cut off from the outside world. My sisters, like this French court in Algiers, have accepted my statement with polite incredulity. Their letters have been full of love, half-veiled reproach, anxiety as to their social position, and an insane desire to come and take care of me. This I have forbidden them to do. The pain they would have inflicted on themselves, dear souls, would have far outweighed the comfort I might have gained from their ministrations. Then I have had piteous letters from Dale. Your telegram reassured me, though I was puzzled. Now I get a letter from Lola telling me it's all off, that she never loved me, that she valued my youth and my friendship, but that it is best for us not to meet again. What is the meaning of it, Simon? For heaven's sake, tell me. I can't think of anything else. I can't sleep. I'm going off my head. Again. This awful newspaper report and your letter of explanation, I have them side by side. Forgive me, Simon, I don't know what to believe, where to turn. I have looked up to you as the best and straightest man I know. You must be. Yet why have you done this? Why didn't you tell me she was married? Why didn't she tell me? I can't write properly. My head is all of a buzz. The beastly papers say you were living with her in Algiers, but you weren't, were you? It would be too horrible. In fact, you say you weren't, but all the same you have stolen her from me. It wasn't like you. And this awful murder, my God, you don't know what it all means to me. It's breaking my heart. And Lady Kinnersley wrote, with what object I scarcely know. The situation was far beyond the poor lady's bylaws and regulations for the upbringing of families and the conduct of life. The elemental mother in her battled on the side of her only son, foolishly, irrationally, unkindly. Her exordium was as correct as could be. The tragedy shocked her, the scandal grieved her. The innuendo knows of the press she refused to believe. She sympathised with me deeply. But then she turned from me to Dale, and feminine unreason took possession of her pen. She bitterly reproached herself for having spoken to me of Madame Brandt. Had she known how passionate and real was this attachment, she would never have interfered. The boy was broken-hearted. He accused me of having stolen her from him, his own words. He took little interest in his electioneering campaign, spoke badly, unconvincingly, spent hours in alternate fits of listlessness and anger. She feared for her darling's health and reason. She made an appeal to me, who professed to love him. If it were honourably possible, would I bring Madame Brandt back to him? She was now to accept Dale's estimate of her worth. Could I at the least prevail on Madame Brandt to give him some hope of what she did not know, but some hope that would save him from ruining his career and doing something desperate? And another letter from Dale. I can't work at this election. For God's sake, give her back to me. Then I won't care. What is Parliament to me without her? The election is as good as lost already. The other side has made as much as possible of the scandal. The only letters that have not been misery to read have come from Eleanor Faversham. There was one passage which made me thank God that he had created such women as Eleanor. Don't fret over the newspaper lies, dear. Those who love you, and why shouldn't I love you still, know the honourable gentleman that you are. Write to me if it would ease your heart, and tell me just what you feel you can. Now and always you have my utter sympathy and understanding. And this is the woman of whose 1,000 virtues I dared to speak in flippant jest. Heaven forgive me. After receiving Lady Kinnersley's appeal, I went to Lola. It was just before the case came on of the Cour d'Assises. She had finished luncheon in her private room and was sitting over her coffee. I joined her. She wore the black blouse and skirt with which I have not yet been able to grow familiar, as it robbed her of the peculiar fascinating quality which I have tried to suggest by the word pantherine. Coffee over, we moved to the window which opened on a little back garden. The room was on the ground floor, in which grew prickly pear and mimosa and newly flowering heliotrope. I don't know why I should mention this, except that some scenes impress themselves, for no particular reason, on the memory, while others associated with more important incidents fade into vagueness. I picked a bunch of heliotrope, which she pinned at her bosom. "Lola," I said, "I want to speak to you seriously." She smiled wanly. "Do we ever speak otherwise these dreadful days?" "It's about Dale. Read this," said I, and I handed her Lady Kinnersley's letter. She read it through and returned it to me. "Well?" "I asked you a week or two ago what you were going to do with your life," I said. "Does that letter offer you any suggestion?" "I'm to give him some hope? What hope can I give him?" "You're a free woman, free to marry. For the boy's sake, the mother will consent. When she knows you as well as we know you, she will—" "She will what? Love me?" "She's a woman not given to loving, except in unexpected bursts, her offspring. But she will respect you." She stood for a few moments silent, her arms resting against the window jamb and her head on her arm. She remained there so long that at last I rose and, looking at her face, saw that her eyes were full of tears. She dashed them away with the back of her hand, gave me a swift look, and went and sat in the shadow of the room. An action of this kind on the part of a woman signifies a desire for solitude. I lit a cigarette and went into the garden. It was a sorry business. I saw as clearly as Lola that Lady Kinnersley's desire to purchase Dale's immediate happiness at any price, and that the future might bring bitter repentance. But I offered no advice. I finished playing a deputy Providence. A madman letting off fireworks in a gunpowder factory plays a less dangerous game. Presently she joined me and ran her arm through mine. "I'll write to Dale this afternoon," she said. "Don't let us talk of it any more now. You are tired out. It's time for you to go and lie down. I'll walk with you up the hill." "It has come to this, that I must lie down for some hours during the day, lest I should fall to pieces." "I suppose I'll have to," I laughed. "What a thing it is to have the wits of a man and the strength of a baby." She pressed my arm and said in her low, caressing voice, which I had not heard for many weeks, "I shouldn't be so proud of those man's wits if I were you." I know she said it playfully with reference to masculine non-perception of the feminine, but I chose to take it broadly. "My dear Lola," said I, "it has been borne in upon me that I am the most witless fool that the unwisdom of generations of English country squires has ever succeeded in producing." "Don't talk rot," she said, with foolishness in her eyes. She accompanied me, bareheaded in the sunshine, to the gate of my hotel. "Come and dine with me if you're well enough," she said as we parted. I assented, and when the evening came, I went. Did I not say that we were like two lost souls wandering alone in the mist? It was only when I rose to bid her good night that she referred to Dale. "I wrote to him this afternoon," she announced curtly. "You said you would do so." "Would you like to know what I told him?" She put her hands behind her back and stood facing me somewhat defiantly in all her magnificence. I smiled. Women, much as they scoff at the blindness of our sex, are often transparent. "It's your firm determination to tell me," said I. "Well?" She advanced a step nearer to me and looked me straight in the eyes defiantly. "I told him that I loved you with all my heart and all my soul. I told him that you didn't know it, that you didn't care a brass curse for me, that you had acted as you thought best for the happiness of himself and me. I told him that while you lived, I could not think of another man. I told him that if you could face death with a smile on your face, he might very well show the same courage, and not chuck things right and left just because a common woman wouldn't marry him or live with him and spoil his career. There, that's what I told him. What do you think?" "Heaven knows what effect it will have," said I, wearily, for I was very, very tired. "But why, my poor Lola, have you wasted your love on a shadow like me?" She answered, after the foolish way of women, "I have not heard from either Dale or Lady Kinnersley. A day or two ago, in reply to a telegram to Raggles, I learned that Dale had lost the election." This, then, is the end of my apologia pro vita mea, which I began with so resonant a flourish of vainglory. I have said all that is said. Nothing more has happened, or is likely to happen, until they put me under the earth. Oh, yes, I was forgetting. In spite of my Monte Cristo munificence, poor Latimer has been hammered on the Stock Exchange. Poor Lucy and the kids. I shall have, I think, just enough strength left to reach Mentone. This place is intolerable now. And there I shall put myself under the care of a capable physician, who, with his abominable drugs, will doubtless begin the cheerful work of inducing the mental decay, which I suppose must precede physical dissolution. I must confess that I am disappointed with the manner of my exit. I had imagined it quite different. I had beheld myself turning with a smile and a jest for one last view of the faces over which I, in my humorous career, had cast the largesse of happiness, and the vanishing with a gallant carelessness through the dusky portals. Instead of that, here am I sneaking out of life by the back door, covering my eyes for very shame. And glad? Oh, God, how glad I am to slink out of it. I have indeed accomplished the thing which I set out to do. I have severed a boy from the object of his passion. What an achievement for the crowning glory of a lifetime! And at what a cost! One fellow creature's life and another's reason. On me lies the responsibility. It is true, did not adorn this grey world, but he drew the breath of life, and through my jesting agency it was cut off. Anastasios Papadopoulos, had he not come under my malign influence, would have lived out his industrious, happy, and dream-filled days. Lesser, but still great price, too, has been paid. Jealous hatred, misery, and failure for the being I care most for in the world, the shame of a sordid scandal to those that hold me dear, the hopeless love and speedy mourning of a woman not without greatness. I have tried to make a tom-fool of Destiny, and Destiny has proved itself to be the superior jester of the two, and has made a grim and bedraggled tom-fool of me. I must end this. I have just fallen in a faint on the floor, and Rogers has revived me with some drops Huntington has given me in view of such a contingency. These are the last words I shall write. Life is too transcendently humorous for a man not to take it seriously. Compared with it, death is but a shallow jest. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Simon the Jester, William John Locke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Simon Evers. Chapter 16. It is many weeks since I wrote those words which I thought were to be my last. I read them over now and laugh aloud. Life is more devilishly humorous than I in my most nightmare dreams ever imagined. Instead of dying at Mentone as I proposed, I am here at Mustafa Superior, still living. And let me tell you the master joke of the arch-jester. I am going to live. I am not going to die, I am going to live. I am quite well. Think of it. Is it farcical, comical, tragical, or what? This is how it has befallen. The last thing I remember of the old conditions was Rogers packing my things and a sudden, awful, excruciating agony. I lost consciousness, remained for days in a bemused, stupefied state, which I felt convinced was death, and particularly pleasant. At last I woke to a sense of bodily constriction and discomfort, and to the queer realization that what I had taken for the garden of Proserpine was my own bedroom, and that the pale lady whom I had so confidently assumed was she who, crowned with calm leaves, gathers all things mortal with cold immortal hands, was no other than a blue and white-vested hospital nurse. "What the—" I began. "Shoot," she said, flitting noiselessly to my side. "You mustn't talk." And then she poured something down my throat. I lay back, wondering what all this meant. Presently A grizzled and tanned man wearing a narrow black tie came into the room. His face seemed oddly familiar. The nurse whispered to him. He came up to the bed and asked me in French how I felt. "I don't know at all," said I. He laughed. "Oh, that's a good sign. Let me see how you are getting on." He stuck a thermometer in my mouth and held my pulse. These formalities completed, he turned up the bedclothes and did something with my body. Only then did I realise that I was tightly bandaged. My impressions grew clearer, and when he raised his face I recognised the doctor who had sat on the sofa with Anastasius Papadopoulos. "Nothing could be better," said he. "Keep it quiet and all will be well." "Will you kindly explain?" I asked. "You've had an operation. Also a narrow escape." I smiled at him pityingly. "What is the good of taking all this trouble? Why are you wasting your time?" He looked at me uncomprehendingly for a moment, and then he laughed as the light came to him. "Oh, I understand. Yes, your English doctors had told you you were going to die, that an operation would be fatal. So your good friend Madame Brandt informed us. But we, nous autres Français, are more enterprising. Kill or cure. We performed the operation, we didn't kill you, and here you are, cured." My heart sickened with a horrible foreboding. A clamminess such as others feel at the approach of death spread over my brow and neck. "Good God," I cried, "you're not trying to tell me that I'm going to live?" "Why, of course I am," he exclaimed, brutally delighted. "If nothing else kills you, you'll live to be 100. "Oh, damn," said I. "Oh, damn! Oh, damn!" And the tears of physical weakness poured down my cheeks. "Ce sont des drôles de gens, les Anglais," I heard him whisper to the nurse before he left the room. Belonging to a queer folk or not, I found the prospect more and more dismally appalling according as my mind regained its clarity. It was the most overwhelming, piteous disappointment I have ever experienced in my life. I cursed in my whimpering, invalid fashion. "But don't you want to get well?" asked the wide-eyed nurse. "Certainly not. I thought I was dead, and I was very happy. I've been tricked and cheated and fooled." And I dashed my fist against the counterpane. "If you go on in this way," said the nurse, "you will commit suicide." "I don't care," I cried. And then, they tell me, fainted. My temperature also ran up, and I became light-headed again. It was not until the next day that I recovered my sanity. This time Lola was in the room with the nurse, and after a while the latter left us together. Even Lola could not understand my paralysing dismay. "But think of it, my dear friend," she argued. "Just think of it. You are saved by a miracle. The doctor says you will be stronger than you have ever been before." "All the more dreadful will it be," said I. "I finished with life. I'd gone through with it. I don't want a second lifetime. One is quite enough for any sane human being. Why on earth couldn't they have let me die?" Lola passed her cool hand over my forehead. "You mustn't talk like that, Simon," she said, in her deepest and most caressing voice, using my name somewhat hesitatingly for the first time. "You mustn't. A miracle really has been performed. You've been raised from the dead, like the man in the Gospel." "Yes," said I petulantly, "Lazarus. And does the Gospel tell us what Lazarus really thought of the unwarrantable interference with his plans? Of course he had to be polite." "Oh, don't!" cried Lola, shocked. In a queer, unenlightened way, she was a religious woman. "I'm sorry," said I, feeling ashamed of myself. "If you knew how I had prayed God to make you well," she said. "If I could have died for you, I would gladly. But I wanted to die, my dear Lola," I insisted with the egotism of the sick. "I object to this resuscitation. I say it is monstrous that I should have to start a second lifetime at my age. It's all very well when you begin at the age of half a minute, but when you begin at 38 years... "You have all the wisdom of 38 years to start with." "There is only one thing more disastrous to a man than the wisdom of 38 years, I declared with mulish inconvincibility, "and that is the wisdom he may accumulate after that age." She sighed and abandoned the argument. "We are going to make you well in spite of yourself," she said. They, namely the doctor, the nurse, and Lola, have done their best, and they have succeeded. But their task has been a hard one. The patient's will to live is always a great factor in his recovery. My disgust at having to live has impeded my convalescence, and I fully believe that it is only Lola's tears and the doctor's frenzied appeals to me not to destroy the one chance of his life of establishing a brilliant professional reputation that have made me consent to face existence again. As for the doctor, he was pathetically insistent. "But you must get well," he gesticulated. "I am going to publish it, your operation. It will make my fortune. I shall at last be able to leave this hole of an Algiers and go to Paris. You don't know what I have done for you. I've performed an operation on you that has never been performed successfully before. I thought it had been done, but I found out afterwards my English confrères were right. It hasn't. I've worked a miracle in surgery, and by my publication will make you, as the subject of it, famous for ever. And here you are, trying to die and ruin everything. I ask you, have you no human feelings left?" At the conclusion of these lectures I would sigh and laugh and stretch out a thin hand. He shook it always with a humorous grumpiness which did me more good than the prospect of acquiring fame in the annals of the École de Médecine. Here am I, however, cured. I have thrown away the stick with which I first began to limp about the garden, and I discouraged Lola and Rogers in their efforts to treat me as an invalid. Like the doctor, I had been longing to escape from this hole of an Algiers and its painful associations, and when I was able to leave my room it occurred to me that the sooner I gained my strength, the sooner should I be able to do so. Since then my recovery has been rapid. The doctor is delighted and slaps me on the back and points me out to Lola and the manager and the concierge and the hoary old sinner of an Arab who displays his daggers and trays and embroideries on the trevorrows as a living wonder. I believe he would like to put me in a cage and carry me about with him in Paris on exhibition. But he is reluctantly prepared to depart with me, and has consented to my return in a few days' time to England by the North German Lloyd steamer. He is ordered the sea voyage as a finishing touch to my cure. Good deluded man, he thinks that it is for his fortuitous science that has dragged me out of the valley of the shadow and set me in the garden of life. Good deluded man, he does not realize that he has been merely the tool of the arch Jester. He has no notion of the sardonic joke his knife was chosen to perpetrate. That naked we should come into the world and naked we should go out is a time-honoured pleasantry, which, as far as the latter part of it is concerned, I did my conscientious best to further. But that we should come into it again, naked, at the age of 38, is a piece of irony too grim for contemplation. Yet am I bound to contemplate it. It grins me in the face. Figuratively, I am naked. Partly by my own act, and partly with the help of destiny, the greater jester than I have stripped myself of all these garments of life, which not only enabled me to strut peacock fashion in the pleasant places of the world, but also sheltered me from its inclemencies. I had wealth, not a Rothschild or Vanderbilt fortune, but enough to assure me ease and luxury. I have stripped myself of it. I have but a beggarly sum remaining at my banker's. Practically, I am a pauper. I had political position. I surrendered it as airily as I had achieved it. So airily, indeed, that I doubt whether I could regain it even had I the ambition. For it was a game that I played, sometimes fascinating, sometimes repugnant but to my fastidious sense of honourable dealing, for which I shall never recapture the mood. Mood depends on conditions, and conditions, as I am trying to show, are changed. I had social position. I did not deceive myself as to its value in the cosmic scheme, but it was one of the pleasant things to which I was born, just as I was born to good food and wines and unpatched boots and the morning hot water brought into my bedroom. I liked it. I suspect that it has fled into eternity with the spirit of Captain Vauvenard. The penniless hero of an amazing scandal is not usually made an idol by the exclusive aristocracy of Great Britain. I had a sweet and loyal woman about to marry me. I put Eleanor Faversham for ever out of my life. I had the devotion and hero-worship of a lad whom I thought to train in the paths of honour, love, and happiness. In his eyes, I suppose I am an unconscionable villain. I have stripped myself of everything, and all because the medical faculty of my country sentenced me to death. I really think the Royal Colleges of Surgeons and Physicians ought to pay me an indemnity. And not only have I stripped myself of everything, but I have incurred an incalculable debt. I owe the woman the infinite debt of her love, which I cannot repay. She sheds it on me hourly with a lavishness which scares me. But for her tireless devotion, the doctor tells me, I should not have lived. But for her selfish forbearance, sympathy and compassion, I should have gone as crazy as Anastasius Papadopoulos. Yet the burden of my debt lies iceberg cold on my heart. Now that we are as intimate as man and woman who are still only friends can be, she has lost the magnetic attraction, that subtle mystery of the woman, half goddess, half panther, which fascinated me in spite of myself and made me jealous of poor young Dale. Now that I can see things in some perspective, I confess that, had I not been under sentence of death, and therefore profoundly convinced that I was immune from all such weaknesses of the flesh, I should have realized the temptation of languorous voice and sinuous limbs, of the frank radiation of the animal, enchanted as it was by elusive gleams of the spiritual, of the layest dumb, in a word, of all the sexual damnability of a woman, which, as François Villon had set Sardanapalus to spin among the women, David to forget the fear of God, Herod to slay the Baptist, and made Samson lose his sight. Whether I should have yielded to or resisted the temptation is another matter. Honestly speaking, I think I should have resisted. You see, I should still have been engaged to Eleanor Faversham. But now this somewhat unholy influence is gone from her. She has lifted me in her strong arms as a mother would lift a brat of 10. She has patiently suffered my whimsies as if I had been a sick girl. She has become to me the mere great mothering creature on whom I have depended for custard and the removal of crumbs and creases from under my body, and for support to my tottering footsteps. The glamour has gone from before my eyes. I no longer see her invested in her queer splendour. My invalid peevishness, too, has accentuated my sensitiveness to shades of refinement. There is about Lola a bluffness, a hardihood of speech, a contempt for the polite word and the pretty conventional turning of a phrase, a lack of reticence in the expression of ideas and feelings, which jar, in spite of my gratitude, on my unstrung nerves. Her ignorance, too, of 1,000 things, the knowledge of which is the birthright of such women as Eleanor Faversham, causes conversational excursions to end in innumerable blind alleys. I know that she would give her soul to learn. This she has told me so in so many words, and when in a delicate way I try to teach her, she listens humbly, pathetically, fixing me with her great gold-flecked eyes, behind which a deep sadness burns wistfully. Sometimes when I glance up from my book, I see that her eyes, instead of being bent on hers, have been resting long on my face, and they say, as clearly as articulate speech, "Teach me, love me, use me, do what you will with me. I am yours, your chattel, your thing, till the end of time." I now awake at night and wonder what I shall do with my naked life, sheltered only by the garment of this woman's love, which I have accepted and cannot repay. I groan aloud when I reflect on the irremediable mess, hash, bungle I have made of things. Did ever sick man wake up to such a hopeless welter? Can you be surprised that I regarded it with dismay? Of course, there is a simple way out of it, and into the shadowy world which I contemplated so long, at first with mocking indifference and then with eager longing. A gentleman called Cato once took it with considerable aplomb. The means are to my hand. In my drawer lies the revolver with which the excellent Colonel Bunyan, long since departed from Mustapha Superior, armed me against the banditti of Algiers, and which I forgot to return to him. I could empty one or more of the 6 chambers into my person, and that would be the end. But I don't think history records the suicide of any humorist, however dismal. He knows too well the tricks of the arch-jester's game. Very likely I should merely blow away half my head, and destiny would give my good doctor another chance of achieving immortal fame by gluing it on again. No, I cannot think seriously of suicide by violent means. Of course, I might follow the example of one Antonius Polemon, a later Greek sophist, who suffered so dreadfully from gout that he buried himself alive in the tomb of his ancestors and starved to death. We have a family vault in Highgate Cemetery, of which I possess the key. No, I should be bored and cold, and the coffins would get on my nerves. And besides, there is something suggestive of smug villadom in the idea of going to die at Highgate. Lola came up as I was scribbling this on my knees in the garden. "What are you writing there?" "I am recasting Hamlet's soliloquy," I replied, "and I feel all the better for it." "Here is your egg and brandy." I swallowed it and handed her back the glass. I feel all the better for that, too. As I sat in the shade of the little stone summer-house within the Greek portico, she lingered in the blazing sunshine, her figure all glorious health and supple curves, and the stray brown hairs above the brown mass gleamed with the gold of a Giotto aureole. She stood, a duskily glowing, radiant emblem of life, against the background of spring greenery and rioting convolvulus. I drew a full breath and looked at her as if magnetized. I had the very oddest sensation. She seemed, in Shakespearean phrase, to rain influence upon me. As if she read the stirrings of my blood, she smiled and said, "After all, confess, isn't it good to be alive?" A thrill of physical well-being swept through me. I leaped to my feet. "You witch!" I cried. "What are you doing to me?" "I?" She retreated a step with a laugh. "Yes, you. You are casting a spell on me so that I may eat my words." "I don't know what you are talking about, but you haven't answered my question. It is good to be alive." "Well, it is," I assented, losing all sense of consistency. She flourished the egg and brandy glass. "I'm so glad. Now I know you are really well and will face life as you face death, like the brave man that you are." I cried to her to hold. I had not intended to go as far as that. I confronted death with a smile. I meet life with the wryest of wry faces. She would have none of my arguments. "No matter how damnable it is, it's splendid to be alive. Just to feel that you can fight. Just to feel that you don't care a damn for any old thing that can happen, because you're strong and brave. I do want you to get back all that you've lost through me. And you'll do it. I know that you'll do it. You'll just go out and smash up the world and bring it to your feet. You will, Simon, won't you? I know you will." She quivered like an optimistic Cassandra. "My dear Lola," said I. I was touched. I took her hand and raised it to my lips, whereat she flushed like a girl. "Did you come here to tell me all this?" "No," she replied simply. "It came all of a sudden as I was standing here. I've often wanted to say it. I'm glad I have." She threw back her head and regarded me a moment with a strange, proud smile, then turned and walked slowly away, her head brushing the long scarlet clusters of the pepper trees. End of chapter 16.